Hello and welcome back. Whatever kind of day it has been, however much of it is still sitting on your shoulders, you can put the whole of it down now. Because tonight we are going a very long way back indeed, further back than we usually go. Not to Rome, not to Greece as you picture it, not to marble and philosophers and democracy, but to a time before any of that existed, to the Bronze Age, more than 3,000 years ago, to a city on a windy hill above a narrow strip of sea in what is now the northwest corner of Turkey. You already know its name. It is the most famous city in the history of the world. And for the better part of 2,500 years, educated people were certain it had never existed at all. Tonight we are going to Troy, not the Troy of the poem, with the gods leaning over the battlements and the wooden horse and the face that launched the ships, but the real one, the one that is actually there, in the ground under a mound of earth 90 feet high, dug over by 5 generations of archaeologists who have pulled out of it 9 cities stacked one on top of another, and a great deal that nobody expected. And what they found, when they finally got down to the layer that matters, was not a fortress full of heroes. It was a city of women weaving, loom weights in their thousands, spindle whorls by the box, 10 kilos of crushed sea snails for making purple, and in the burned wreckage of one house, the collapsed remains of an actual loom, with the fire still on it. That is what the real Troy turns out to have been. And by the end of tonight, I am going to tell you what happened to the women who were sitting at those looms. Before the wind comes up off that strait, and we lose ourselves in it entirely, let me say one quiet thing. And then, I will not step outside this world again. If these long evenings spent somewhere very far away and very long ago are the sort of thing you would like to come back to, these few hours of being lifted out of your own century and set down in a stranger one, then you are very welcome to subscribe and to stay for as many of them as you care to. It costs nothing, and it means that on some other night, when sleep is being difficult, this voice and this kind of story will be easy to find your way back to. I do like knowing which corner of the world you are lying in tonight, and what hour it is where you are, whether it is the deep middle of your night or that thin grey hour before the morning has properly decided to arrive. And when you leave a few words below, I look through them far more often than you would ever guess, usually late, when everything else has gone quiet. But let all of that go now. There is a hill waiting, and the wind on it has not changed in 3,000 years. Imagine this, a low green hill, not a mountain, nothing dramatic, standing at the edge of a wide flat plain with a river running through it. Behind you, to the west, perhaps 3 or 4 miles away, there is the sea, and it is not open sea. It is a channel narrow enough that you can see the land on the other side quite clearly. A strip of blue water running away northeast into the haze, and out of that channel, almost every day of the year, there comes a wind. It comes from the north, hard and steady, and with it comes a current, pushing down out of the Black Sea, and through that gap, and into the Aegean. And between the wind and the water that channel is, for a ship with a square sail and no engine, very nearly impossible to get up. That is the single most important fact about this place. That is why there is a city here. Not because of the hill, which is unremarkable, and not because of the plain, which floods. Because of the wind. Because for weeks on end, every sailing season, ships wanting to go north had to stop and wait, and they had to wait somewhere. And somebody was going to be up on that ridge, collecting from them while they did. The strait has a name you will know. The Greeks called it the Hellespont. We call it the Dardanelles. It is about 40 miles long, and at its narrowest it is less than a mile across. And it is one of the handful of places on this planet where geography simply decides history and goes on deciding it for millennia. Everything that wants to go between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea has to go through that gap. Everything. There is no other way, and the Black Sea beyond it is not a dead end. It is the doorway to grain, to timber, to metal, to horses, to the whole enormous cold interior of the world beyond. and for 4,000 years the traffic in and out of it has gone past this hill. Persians crossed there. Alexander crossed there and went up to the mound and laid a wreath on it. The Romans built a city on the same spot, and in 1915, 33 centuries after the Bronze Age city burned, men were still dying in their tens of thousands on those same shores for control of the same channel, which tells you that nothing about the strategic problem had changed at all in 3,000 years. It is the same wind. So put yourself on the water for a moment. In the Bronze Age, in a ship of the period, which is to say a long open boat with a single square sail and a bank of oars and no deck to speak of, and no way of sailing into the wind, because that particular trick will not be invented for another 2 millennia. You have come up the coast with a cargo, you want to get through the strait and into the Sea of Marmara and on to the north, and you cannot. The wind is coming straight down the channel into your face, and the current is coming with it at 3 or 4 knots, and you can row against it for an hour if your men are fresh, and you will go nowhere. So you do what everybody did. You put in at the mouth, in the lee, in a bay, and you wait for a southerly, and southerlies in that channel are rare and short, and you may be waiting a month. Now multiply that by every ship in that sea, every season, for centuries. There is a permanent, involuntary, floating population of merchants and crews sitting at the entrance to that strait, with nothing to do and cargo to sell and money to spend. And there is a walled town 3 miles inland with a king in it. That is the business model. Troy was not rich because it was beautiful or holy or clever. Troy was rich because of a prevailing wind. The plain is worth a moment, because the plain is where the poem happens, and the plain is not there anymore. When you stand on the mound today, you are looking out over flat farmland, and the sea is a good 3 or 4 miles away, a distant line. And for a very long time, that was one of the strongest arguments against the whole identification, because in the Iliad, the ships are drawn up on a beach, and the fighting surges back and forth between the beach and the wall in a single afternoon, and men run from one to the other. And you cannot do that across 4 miles of ploughed field. But the coast has moved. That is what the geologists established, and it is a lovely piece of work. In the Bronze Age, there was a bay there. A proper deep bay, reaching inland almost to the foot of the hill, so that Troy was very nearly a coastal town with the water in front of it, and the 2 rivers that come down that plain, the Scamander and the Simois, ran into it. And those rivers have been carrying silt down off the mountains ever since, and dumping it in that bay for 3,000 years, and they have filled it in completely. The city did not move. The sea left. Which means that the geography of the poem is the geography of a coastline that stopped existing before the poem was written, and that whoever composed it was working from a description of a place that no longer looked like that. It also means the fighting distance works. It also means the harbour that made Troy rich is now under a wheat field, along with everything else, and the rivers are still in the poem, doing something extraordinary. The Scamander is a character. In one of the strangest passages in the Iliad, Achilles kills so many men in the river that he chokes it with bodies, and the river itself rises up in fury and comes after him, out of its banks across the plain, trying to drown him, and he runs for his life from water, and it is only stopped when another god sets it on fire. Now, that is myth. But that river floods. That plain floods, seasonally, badly, and always has. And anybody who has ever farmed it knows that the Scamander in spate is a genuinely dangerous thing that will run you down in the open. The poem's most surreal episode is Underneath, a completely accurate piece of local knowledge about a river in flood, from someone who had seen it or been told by someone who had, now the hill itself, because the hill is a strange object, and we should be clear about what it actually is. It is called Hisarlik, which is Turkish, and means, roughly, the place of the fortress, and it sits near a village called Tevikiye, and it is about 200 meters across and stands some 30 meters above the plain, which is around 90 feet, about the height of a decent church tower. And here is the thing, it is not a natural hill. It is a tell, which is one of the eerier things the ancient world left us. A tell is what happens when people build in mud brick, and then, every century or so, the buildings fall down or burn down or are pulled down. And instead of carting away the rubble, the next generation simply flattens it and builds on top. Do that for 3,000 years and the town rises slowly on the accumulated wreckage of itself, until it is standing 90 feet in the air on a mound made entirely out of its own past. That is what Hisarlik is. Every foot of that mound is somebody's collapsed house. The whole of it is people. One more note about the mound itself, because it explains why anybody stopped there at all, and it is under your feet the whole time you are up there. Water. That is the first question for any settlement anywhere, and it is the question people forget to ask. You cannot put a settlement on high ground merely because high ground is defensible. You can only put one there if it has water, or the first siege is over in a week, and so are you. And that particular mound has been continuously occupied for something like 4,000 years, which is one of the longest runs anywhere on Earth. And a run like that does not happen by luck. It happens because of springs. There is water in that mound. There are springs and an elaborate arrangement for getting at them, including cut channels and, remarkably, a system of tunnels driven into the rock, which the excavators have explored and which appears to be extraordinarily old, older than the Bronze Age city, by a very long way. Someone, in the deep prehistory of that spot, went into the rock after the water and cut passages to reach it. And those were still in use 2 or 3 millennia later, because water does not go out of fashion. And that is the real reason for Troy. Everything else I have told you tonight is a superstructure. The wind stops the ships, the strait makes the money, the wall keeps the money. But underneath all of it is the fact that there is a rise of ground, near the mouth of the most important channel in that world, that happens to have water in it, and a plain around it that grows grain and grass. Take the springs away, and there is no city, and no poem, and no evening like this one. And nobody has ever heard of the place. It is worth remembering that when you get to the wall, which we will, and which is the thing everybody comes for, all of that engineering, and all of that wealth, and all of that reputation, and the whole thing is standing there because of water in a rock. The Bronze Age is not, in the end, about bronze. It's about someone finding a spring in a good spot and staying, and then their children staying, and then 4 millennia going by. And when they cut into it, they found 9 cities, 9. Labelled in the driest possible way, Troy 1 through Troy 9. And they run from about 3,000 years before the Common Era all the way through to the Roman period and the 5th century of our own era, which is close to 4,000 years of continuous human occupation of one hilltop, an almost unbelievable run. In 2019, the current excavator identified something older still underneath a lot of them and called it Troy 0, which I love because it means that even now, 150 years into digging this hill, the bottom of it is still moving. 9 cities, each one built on the ruin of the last, each with its own walls and its own pottery and its own fashions and its own catastrophe. And somewhere in that stack, in a band of earth you could cover with a blanket, is the one we all came for. Before we go into it, though, I want to tell you the single most astonishing thing about the real Troy, because it is not a stone or a wall or a piece of gold. It is a name written in wet clay, 700 miles away, by a bored clerk who had never heard of Homer and never would. Here is the situation. For most of the 19th century, and for a long time after, the scholarly position on Troy was straightforward. It is a story. There is no evidence of any kind, outside the poem, that such a city ever existed, and the poem was composed centuries after the events it claims to describe, by a man who may or may not have been one man, working in a tradition of oral verse, where the whole point is that things are embellished. So Troy is a myth, Helen is a myth, the war is a myth, and educated people do not go looking for the houses of imaginary people. And then, quite separately, with no interest in Homer at all, archaeologists began digging up the capital of the Hittite Empire. The Hittites are the great forgotten superpower. That is not an exaggeration. For roughly 500 years, through the late Bronze Age, they ran an empire across most of what is now Turkey and down into Syria, and they were one of the 2 or 3 genuine great powers of that world, on a level with Egypt. They fought the Egyptians to a standstill at Kadesh, and then signed the earliest surviving peace treaty in human history with them. And then they vanished so completely that until about 150 years ago, essentially nobody knew they had ever been there. Their capital was at a place called Hattusa, out in the middle of Anatolia, and when it was excavated, the archives came out of the ground. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, baked hard and preserved by the very fire that destroyed the palace. In a language nobody could read, it took decades to crack, and when they cracked it, it turned out to be an entirely unsuspected Indo-European language, related, distantly, to Greek and to Latin and to English. And the tablets are not poetry, they are the filing, they are letters and treaties and complaints and reports and the tedious daily correspondence of an empire minding its business. And in those tablets, over and over, there is a city out on the western edge of the Hittite world, on the coast, a vassal state, minor, distant, a long way from anywhere the Hittite kings really cared about, and it is called Wilusa. Now follow this, because it is beautiful. Homer does not usually call the city Troy. His most common name for it, by a wide margin, is Ilios, which is where the word Iliad comes from. The Iliad means, simply, the poem about Ilios. And Greek, in Homer's day, had lost a letter. It used to have a W sound, written with a character called digamma. And by the time the poems were written down, the W had dropped out of the dialect and the letter had fallen out of the alphabet. But the poems are older than the writing, and the meter remembers. There are lines in the Iliad that only scan properly if you put the W back, which means that the older, truer form of the name Ilios is Wilios, and the Hittite clerks, writing in cuneiform on the other side of Anatolia, 3 or 4 centuries before Homer, with no knowledge of any epic, were calling a city on that shore Wilusa. There is more. The Greeks had a second name for the place, Troia, our Troy, and the Hittite records also mention a place written something like Taruisa in the same region. 2 names in the songs, 2 names in the archive, and they line up. It is possible, and some think likely, that the 2 names originally meant 2 different things, the citadel and the town around it, and that Homer kept both because having 2 words for the same place gives a poet working in a strict meter a very useful bit of room. But the point stands, and it is enormous. A name that the Greeks were singing about in the 8th century before the Common Era, in verse everyone agreed was fiction, was being written down as an ordinary administrative fact by foreign bureaucrats 5 centuries earlier, on the ground, exactly where the hill actually stands. Troy is on file, and then it gets worse or better, depending on how you feel about the ground moving under you, because we have the treaty. Around the year 1280 before the Common Era, the Hittite king Muwatalli II concluded a formal agreement with the king of Wilusa, and a copy of it survives, and it is a completely ordinary document. It is a vassal treaty. It sets out the obligations. The vassal will be loyal, will report conspiracies, will send troops when required, will not deal with the king's enemies. There are gods invoked as witnesses on both sides, which is standard. There is a long list of curses for breaking it, which is also standard. It is the sort of thing that empire produced by the thousand, and that no one has ever found interesting, except for one detail. The king of Wilusa, in that treaty, is named, and his name is Alexandru. Sit with that. In the Iliad, the man whose act begins the whole catastrophe, the son of the king of Troy, the one who takes Helen, has two names. Most people know him as Paris. But throughout the poem, constantly, Homer also calls him something else. And it is the name he uses more often. And it is Alexandros. Alexandros of Ilios. And in a Hittite archive, in a document that has nothing to do with poetry, in the right period, in the right place. The king of Wilusa is Alexandru. I want to be very careful here, because this is exactly the point at which it is tempting to run ahead of the evidence, and I am not going to do that to you. Alexandru is not Paris. The date is wrong, for one thing. The treaty is a century or so before the destruction that most people connect with the war, and Alexandros is a perfectly good Greek name that means more or less defender of men. And there are arguments that a Luwian-speaking Anatolian king might have carried a Greek name for all sorts of reasons, or that the resemblance is coincidence. Serious scholars disagree about it, and will go on disagreeing. But here is what it does establish. And this part is not in dispute. There was a real kingdom called Wilusa. It had kings. One of those kings was called something extremely close to the name Homer gives the Trojan prince. And the poem, which everybody had agreed for 2,000 years was made up out of nothing, turns out to be carrying, in its oldest layers, the actual name of a real king of the actual city, preserved by illiterate singers, passed mouth to mouth for 400 or 500 years, across a dark age in which the Greeks forgot how to write, and handed to us intact. That is what oral tradition can do. It cannot give you history. It is not a chronicle, and it was never trying to be. But it is an astonishing carrier of proper nouns, and it turns out to have been holding on to some things, very tightly indeed, for a very long time, in the dark. And there is one more, and this one is a war. The tablets from Hattusa describe, across several reigns, a long-running mess out on that western coast, involving a people, the Hittites, called the Ahiyawa. Nobody is quite certain what that word is. But the majority view is that it is the Hittite way of writing Achaeans, which is Homer's own most common word for the Greeks. He almost never calls them Greeks. There was no such concept. He calls them Achaeans. And the Hittite record shows the Ahiyawa coming from across the sea, meddling in the western coast for generations, backing a warlord called Piamaradu, an opportunist and a genuine nuisance who spent decades raiding and rebelling and being sheltered by the Ahiyawa whenever the Hittites got close to catching him. And Piamaradu attacked Wilusa. He attacked it. And the king of Wilusa had to write to the Hittite king for help. There is also a letter, a famous one, in which a Hittite king writes to a king of Ahiyawa about the trouble the two of them have had, and mentions, in passing, almost in an aside, that there was that business between us over Wilusa. Over Wilusa, a quarrel between the Greeks and the great power of Anatolia, on file, about Troy. That is not the Trojan War. It is 100 years too early, and there is no Helen in it, and no horse, and no Achilles. But it is something better than a myth confirmed. It is the discovery that the thing poem is actually about Greeks from over the water making trouble at Troy for a generation was a real and recurring feature of the late Bronze Age, tedious enough to end up in the correspondence of an empire that had bigger problems. The poem gives you one enormous war. The tablets suggest something more plausible and more human. 2 centuries of intermittent grief over the same small rich city on the same windy hill. So now let us go up the hill and look at the thing itself. In about the year 1200 before the Common Era, at the very end of the Bronze Age, when this place is as good as it is ever going to get, the first thing you would see, from a long way out on the plain, is the wall. And the wall is genuinely extraordinary, and it is still there, and I would like you to have it properly in your head. It is not a straight wall. It runs in a series of long, shallow curves around the crown of the hill, and it is built of beautifully cut limestone blocks, fitted, and here is the detail that everybody notices. It leans. The face of it slopes inwards as it rises. at a consistent angle so that the whole wall seems to be leaning back away from you. And it is not a mistake or a settling. It is deliberate. It is engineering. A battered wall like that is far harder to undermine and far harder to get a ladder against, and it sheds the weight of the earth behind it beautifully. And at intervals along it, there are vertical grooves cut into the face, purely so that the light does something interesting as it moves across during the day. Somebody in the Bronze Age looked at a defensive wall and thought about how it would look in the afternoon. The stone part of it, the part that survives, stood perhaps 5 or 6 meters, and on top of that was more wall again in mud brick, and towers above that, so that the whole thing rose to something like 9 meters, 30 feet, all the way round the hill. Above the slope. From the plain it would have been the most imposing man-made object for 100 miles. The gates deserve a moment, because a gate is the weak point of any wall, and because of what Homer does with one of them. Troy VI had several, and they are still there, and you can walk through them. And they are cleverly done. The main one on the south is not a simple hole in the wall. You approach it up a paved ramp with the wall on your right, which means that anybody coming at it has to walk a long way with his unshielded side exposed to the men on the tower above, because a man carries his shield on his left. That is not an accident. Somebody thought about it. And there is a great square tower beside it, and the whole arrangement is a killing ground disguised as an entrance. And in the poem, there is a gate called the Scaean Gate, and everything happens at it. It is the gate the army goes out of. It is where Hector says goodbye to his wife and his baby son, in the most famous domestic scene in ancient literature, where the child is frightened of the plume on his father's helmet, and Hector laughs and takes it off and puts it on the ground and picks the boy up. And that is the last time she sees him. It is where Achilles kills Hector. It is where Achilles himself is fated to die. And it has a great tower over it, where the old men sit and where Helen walks. Now, the excavators have argued for a century about which gate, if any, is the Scaean Gate. And there is no answer, and there is not going to be. But the poem's obsession with one particular gate, with a tower on it, that everything funnels through, is exactly right about how these places worked. A Bronze Age city has a gate the way a body has a throat. It is where everything comes in and goes out. It is where the news arrives. It is where you stand to watch for someone. It is where the market is, and where the old men sit, because it is the one place where something might happen. If you wanted to know anything, in any ancient city, you went and stood at the gate. So when the tradition put every important moment in the story at the gate, it was not being lazy. It was remembering, quite accurately, that in a walled town, the gate is where life is. And the sentence I cannot shake is the one about Andromache. After Hector is dead, Homer says that she had gone up onto the tower of the wall because she had heard the noise, and that she stood there and looked out, and saw him being dragged. She had run there from her loom, with the bath still heating. There is a tower on that hill. It is by the gate. You can stand on what is left of it and look out at the plain. And the plain is a wheat field now, and the wind is exactly the same. And in the poem, the wall is described endlessly with a set of stock phrases. Troy of the good walls, Troy of the wide streets. Well-built Ilios, beetling Ilios, which is to say overhanging, leaning. Homer, or the tradition behind him, is describing a wall that leans 400 years after it fell down. There is a moment in the Iliad where Patroclus tries to climb the wall and is knocked off it 3 times by a god, and another where somebody points out that there is one stretch. On the western side, where the wall is weaker and can be scaled, and the excavators going round that circuit found that the northwestern section is built differently and less well than the rest. I do not know what to do with that. It is probably coincidence. It is a very strange coincidence. Inside the wall, the citadel, and this is where the picture that most people have needs adjusting, because the citadel is small. Enclosed, it is about 20,000 square meters, which sounds like a lot until you realize it is roughly 2 hectares, about 3 football pitches. There is a ring of large houses set on terraces, stepping up towards the summit, well built, of good stone, with wide rooms. And there is not much else. At the very top, where the palace would have been, there is nothing at all, because the Romans came along 13 centuries later and levelled the crown of the hill flat to build a temple on it. And through the whole of Bronze Age Troy's centre over the side. The most important building in the story is not missing. It was tipped down the slope by a work gang 2,000 years ago, and nobody wrote down where it went. So what? You have inside the walls is perhaps a few hundred people. The king, whatever a king was here, his family. The people who mattered in their fine houses, up on the terraces, looking out over the plain and the river and the sea. And for 100 years, that was the whole of the argument against the Iliad, and it was a good argument. And it went like this. This is not a city. This is a manor house with a very good wall. You cannot besiege this for 10 years with 1,000 ships. There is nothing here worth a fleet. Homer's Troy is a great town, with wide streets and crowds and towers, and a population that fills a battlefield. And the actual Hisarlik is a hill fort with about 400 people in it and a nice view. The poem is exaggeration. It always was. And then, in 1988, a German archaeologist named Manfred Kaufmann came back to the hill with a machine. The machine was a magnetometer. And what it does is very simple and slightly magical. You walk it across a field, slowly, back and forth, in lines, and it reads tiny variations in the magnetism of the soil underneath. And it turns out that the soil remembers. Where there has been fire, where there has been a ditch cut and refilled, where there has been a wall or a hearth or a kiln, the magnetic signature is different permanently. And a machine at the surface can see it without a spade ever touching the ground. So Kaufmann's team went out into the ordinary agricultural fields south of the mound, the flat-ploughed farmland that everybody had walked over for a century on their way to the interesting bit. And they read the ground, and the ground was full of city, streets, house walls, foundations, hearths, going on, out under the fields, for hundreds of meters beyond the citadel wall, in every direction to the south. And then, further out, running in a great arc around the whole of it, something else, a ditch. A serious ditch cut down into the solid bedrock, 4 meters wide and 2 meters deep, with what appears to have been a wooden palisade behind it, and a gap in it for a gate, cut into rock, by hand, in the Bronze Age. That is not a boundary marker, and it is not a drainage feature, whatever the skeptics said. And there is no argument about what a ditch of those dimensions is for. It is not deep enough to stop a man. A man can climb down and up it. It is exactly deep enough, and exactly wide enough, to stop a horse. It is an anti-chariot ditch. And in the Iliad, when the Greeks build their own defensive works on the beach, Homer describes a ditch dug so far down and set with stakes so thick and sharp that a horse could never cross it, much less the chariots behind. So the picture inverted. Everything everybody had ever excavated at Troy, from Schliemann in 1870 through to the 1930s, was the citadel. It was the Acropolis, the top, the king's compound, the bit on the hill. 5 generations of archaeologists had been digging the castle and calling it the city, and the actual city, the town, the place where the people were, was lying under a wheat field a few hundred meters south, and nobody had ever looked. Because there was nothing to see, and when Kaufmann's people put trenches into it, they came up with Bronze Age pottery and house walls and the ordinary rubbish of ordinary lives, over an area that took the settlement from about 20,000 square meters to something in the region of 200,000 and possibly more, 10 times bigger. 15 times, he said, at his most confident, and he was not a modest man about it. which changes everything, because it changes the population. A citadel of 2 hectares holds a few hundred people. A walled town of 20 hectares or more, at Bronze Age densities, holds something between 5 and 10,000. And a walled town of that size at the entrance to the Dardanelles, with a ditch and a monopoly on the wind, is not a manor house with a view. That is one of the larger cities in that world. That is a place worth crossing a sea for. I should be honest with you that this became a war of its own. It is called the Tübingen debate, after the university where both men worked, and it was ferocious. Kaufmann said the lower city was real, and Troy was a major trading centre. A historian at the same institution, Frank Kolb, said this was wishful thinking and salesmanship, that the finds down in the lower town were thin and scattered, that a ditch does not make a metropolis, and that Kaufmann was reading a poem into a field. There was an exhibition in Stuttgart at the turn of the millennium, seen by the better part of 1 million visitors, with reconstructions of the place so confident and so unlabelled that you could not tell what was evidence and what was an artist's guess. And that made the row very much worse, and it deserved to. This is the part of archaeology nobody puts in the documentaries. 2 professors, in the same building, not speaking, over a wheat field. Further digging in 2003 went Kaufmann's way, and the lower city is now broadly accepted. And the current excavators have dated its pottery firmly to the right period, but he did not live to enjoy it. He died in 2005, and it is his life's argument, and he won it posthumously. And the man who leads the dig now is Rustam Aslan, who worked beside him for 20 years, and who is the first Turkish archaeologist to run Troy since the first spade went in. So now we know how big it was, but that is not what it was like, and what it was like is why we came. So let me tell you what they actually find when they dig in that soil day after day, season after season, by the crate. Not weapons, not gold. Loom weights. A loom weight is an unremarkable object. It is a lump of fired clay, usually somewhere between the size of a plum and the size of your fist, with a hole through it. It is the least glamorous thing in any museum in the world. And what it does is this. On an upright loom, the warp threads, the vertical ones, hang down from a beam, and they have to be held taut, or you cannot weave. And so you tie them off in bundles at the bottom and hang a weight on each bundle. That is all. A weight on a string, holding a thread straight. And they are made of clay, so they survive absolutely everything. Fire does not touch them. Time does not touch them. They are effectively immortal, and they are the single most common find on the site. And they come out of that mound in their thousands, and their thousands, and their thousands over again. Along with spindle whorls, which are the little weighted discs you put on a stick to spin fibre into thread in the first place, and which come up by the box load. That is the real Troy, not the horse, not the ships, a hill covered in the equipment of cloth, and that is not a curiosity. It is an economy. Think about what those numbers actually mean on the ground. Weaving in the Bronze Age is not a hobby, and it is not decoration. It is one of the 2 or 3 largest industries in existence, and it is enormously, brutally labour-intensive. To make cloth, you have to get the wool off the animal and wash it and comb it and then spin it. And spinning is the bottleneck. A woman with a spindle produces thread very slowly. And a single decent garment might take weeks of spinning before a single thread of it goes onto a loom. Then it has to be woven, and a large piece on an upright loom is months of standing work. Walking back and forth in front of it, passing the weft, beating it up, hour upon hour upon hour. The estimates for the great palace economies of that age are staggering. Textiles were the main manufactured export of the entire Bronze Age Mediterranean. And that work, all of it, everywhere, without exception, was done by women. So when they come up in those quantities at Troy, you are not finding a domestic detail. You are finding the factory floor. You are looking at the actual engine of that city's wealth, and you are looking, therefore, at its workforce. And its workforce was female. The wind stopped the ships, and the ships had to buy something while they waited, and what Troy had to sell, along with whatever it was charging them simply to exist, was cloth, made by women, in their thousands, standing at looms, in the light, in those houses on the terraces, and in that lower town under the wheat, for their entire lives. And then there are the shells. In one layer of Troy VI, the excavators found murex. Murex is a sea snail, a spiky, unpretty thing, and it is famous for exactly one reason. Crushed and rotted in the right way, it yields a dye, and the dye is purple. And purple is the single most valuable substance produced anywhere in the ancient world by weight. It was worth more than silver. The reason is arithmetic. It takes many thousands of snails to dye one garment, which is why for the whole of antiquity, right through Rome, purple was not a colour, it was a statement about the person wearing it. And eventually an emperor made it illegal for anyone else to touch, and they found over 10 kilograms of the shells at Troy, crushed, in one deposit. 10 kilos of broken snails. That is a workshop. That is somebody, in that city, at the end of the Bronze Age, making purple, which means that what came off those looms was not only cloth, it was the high end of the market, the finest thing the age could produce. And it was going out through that strait to be worn by people who mattered, in places we will never know. The Trojan women were not making blankets. They were making the most expensive object in the world. I want to go back to the purple for a moment, because I gave you the fact and not the room. And the room is worth having. Purple in the ancient world is made from sea snails. And the process is one of the most disgusting industrial operations ever devised by human beings. The dye is not in the shell, and it is not obviously in the animal. It is a tiny quantity of secretion from one gland, and to get at it you crush the snail or extract the gland, and then the material has to be left to steep and ripen in vats with salt, in the sun, for days. And what comes out of that is not purple at all. It is a pale liquid. The colour only arrives when the wool comes out of the vat and hits the light and the air, and then it changes in front of you, greenish, then blue, then reddish, then finally that deep, dark red purple, developing as you watch. That part is genuinely magic, and I understand entirely why they thought it was. The rest of it is not. The vats stink. That is the universal testimony of everybody in antiquity who ever mentioned the subject. Dye works smelled so unbelievably foul that in later centuries they were legally pushed to the edges of towns and downwind. And the smell got into the workers and never came out. And there are ancient jokes about it that are not kind. It is the smell of thousands of rotting sea creatures in warm salt water, in the sun, for a week. And it clung. And the arithmetic is the thing that gets me. It takes something in the order of 10,000 snails to produce enough dye for the trim on one garment. 10,000. Which means the shells pile up and pile up and pile up. And that is precisely why we find them. At dye sites all over the Mediterranean, there are mounds of crushed murex, in their millions, the industrial spoil of centuries. And at Troy, in a layer of the sixth city, 10 kilograms of them. So put that in the picture. Somewhere in that city, or just outside it and downwind if they had any sense, there was a place where this was done. Vats. The stink. People. Almost certainly the lowest status people available, standing in it, crushing and steeping and lifting sodden wool out into the light and watching it turn. And the product of that appalling room was the most valuable substance in the world, going out through the strait, to be worn by somebody who would never in their life smell that smell. And Helen, in the poem, he's weaving in purple, and Andromache is working purple cloth when the shuttle drops. Homer puts them both in the most expensive material of the age, and the actual purple of the actual city is 10 kilos of broken snails in the dirt. and the woman who made it is not in the poem at all. And since Helen's marriage is the pretext for the whole story, let us look at what a marriage actually was on that hill, because it was not a love match, and it was not, in most cases, anything a modern person would recognize. Marriage in that world is a transaction between two households, and the woman is the thing being transferred. That is not cynicism, it is simply what the sources describe in every culture around that sea, without exception. She goes in her middle teens to a man she may or may not have met, chosen by her father for reasons that have to do with land, or alliance, or debt, or peace. In Homer, a suitor brings gifts to the bride's father, cattle usually, and the poem casually describes desirable women as worth so many oxen, which tells you everything about the frame. And she leaves her own house and goes to live in his, among his family, under his mother, and that is the rest of her life, and she takes cloth with her. This is the part that connects to everything else we have said tonight. A girl in that world spent her childhood and her adolescence spinning and weaving her own trousseau, and it went with her, and it was hers, and it was very often the only property she would ever personally own. Years of her own work, in a chest. That is largely what a dowry was. Textile. The thing she made with her hands for a decade was the thing that gave her standing in the house she was sent to. So think again about the loom weights. Every one of those little clay lumps was in the hands of a girl or a woman who was making, among much else, herself, her value, her standing, her contribution, her security in old age. If she got one, all of it came off that frame. Weaving was not what women did instead of having a life. It was the life. It was economy and identity and inheritance and art, all at once. And it was the one domain in that entire world that was unambiguously theirs, and in which a woman's skill was visible and judged and remembered. And that is why the poem keeps putting them there. Not because it is a nice domestic touch, because that is where they were. And everyone who first heard those lines knew exactly what it meant to say that a queen was weaving a great purple cloth, or that a young wife was working flowers into a border and warming a bath. It meant she was doing the most important thing a woman did, in the place where she did it, on the last ordinary afternoon of her life. Let me give you a wedding. Because a wedding is the one night. A woman of that age was the centre of everything, and because so much of what we have been talking about, the cloth, the households, the moving of a woman from one house to another, all of it comes together on that one evening under torchlight. We have to be honest that we cannot describe a specifically Trojan wedding in detail, because the Trojans left us almost nothing of their own. And so what I am going to give you is drawn from the weddings the poems describe, and from what we know of that whole world, and I will keep it to what is safe to say, but the shape of it we can trust, because the shape of a wedding in those lands was astonishingly stable, and some of it you would still recognize at a village wedding in those same hills within living memory. It happened in the evening, and it happened by torchlight, and that is the first thing to hold, because it means a wedding was an affair of fire and dark and moving light. The groom came, or sent for the bride, and she was brought from her father's house to his, and the journey between the two houses, however short, was the heart of it. She went in procession, and the procession had torches, pitch pine most likely, throwing that particular restless orange light up onto faces, and it had music, pipes, and a drum, and above all singing, because there were wedding songs, old ones, that everybody knew. And some of them were tender, and some of them were frankly coarse, in the way wedding songs have always been. The older women singing verses to make the girl blush, and everybody laughing, and the torches moving through the dark streets of the city up towards the groom's door. And she wore her best, and she was veiled, and she brought her cloth. This is the thread that runs through everything I have told you tonight, and here is where it arrives. The cloth a woman had woven, all that had been woven for her through the years of her girlhood, came with her to her marriage. It was her wealth, and it was the visible proof of her worth and her industry. and on this night it was carried with her. The folded results of 1,000 hours at the loom into the house where she would now weave for the rest of her life. The loom weights we find in the ground, in their thousands, are the other end of this. Every one of them helped make cloth, and a great deal of that cloth was exactly this: a girl's work, gathered up and carried across the city by torchlight to a new door. There was a feast, and it was probably the best food most of those people ate all year, meat certainly, because a wedding was one of the occasions that justified killing an animal. And the smell of roasting would have gone out over the whole quarter and told everyone what was happening. There was wine, more of it, and less watered than usual. There was noise late into the night. And then the torches and the songs saw the couple to their door, and the crowd sang outside it, and eventually the crowd went home, and it was done. And here is the quiet thing underneath all the fire and the singing. And the poems know it and do not hide it. For the girl, this was also a leaving. She was going from the house she had been born in, from her mother and her sisters and the women she had gone to the water with every morning of her life, into another house, often not far away but sometimes far, to belong to people who were not her own. The wedding songs hold both of these things at once, the joy and the loss, and that is why some of them are so tender. There is a moment in the songs, in more than one tradition, that is spoken as if by the bride's girlhood itself, saying goodbye to her, leaving her, not coming back. She was a bride, and she was the centre of the world for one night of fire and music, and she was also a girl leaving her mother in the dark, and both of those were true. And the city had a song for both. There is more to those women than their work. I have given you the looms and the purple and the ledger of it, and none of that is the same as living. Start with the arithmetic. Because it is brutal, and it is the frame for everything else. A woman in the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean who reached adulthood could expect, on average, to live into her 30s. Not because 35 was old. The average is dragged down savagely by the children, and roughly a third of everyone born did not see 5. But even setting the children aside, adult women died younger than adult men in that world, consistently, everywhere, and the reason is childbirth. She would marry young, in her middle teens most likely. She would be pregnant, on and off, for the whole of the rest of her life, and each of those was a throw of the dice with no medicine behind it at all. No way to turn a baby that would not turn, no way to stop bleeding, no understanding whatever of infection, and a rate of death that meant that every woman in that city had watched it happen to somebody she knew. And the bones tell you about the work. This is the part that gets me, because it is written into the skeletons, and there is no arguing with it. Across the Bronze Age Mediterranean, when you look at the remains of ordinary women, you find the same pattern over and over: severe wear to the knees, to the toes, to the lower back, to the shoulders and the arms. And the cause is known. It is the grinding stone. Turning grain into flour by hand meant kneeling, with the toes bent under you to brace, and pushing a stone back and forth along another stone for hours. Every single day, for your entire life, because bread is not optional and there is no other way to get it. Recent work has found that the arm strength of Neolithic and Bronze Age women, red off the bone, exceeded that of modern elite rowers. That is what grinding does. Those women were physically formidable. And the reason is that they spent their lives doing the hardest sustained manual labour in the settlement, and it was invisible because it happened indoors. So here is the shape of a life in that city, for most of the women in it. Married in your teens, grinding at dawn, spinning in every spare moment, because spinning is the thing you do with your hands while you do everything else. Walking, watching children, talking, the spindle goes everywhere, weaving through the day at an upright loom, standing for hours, walking back and forth in front of it, children and burying some of them, and dying, in all probability before 40, having produced, over that life, an enormous quantity of the single most valuable manufactured good in the Bronze Age world, which went out of that strait to be worn by people who never knew your name and could not have found your city on a map. If there had been maps, that is who was in Troy, not Helen. Them, thousands of them, for 500 years, and they left more of themselves in that hill than any king did. Let me take you to the water in the morning, because the water is where the women of that city met, and it is one of the few places outside the loom room where their whole world came together. And it happened before most of the men were properly awake. I have told you there were springs in the mound, and that they were the reason the place could hold out. And that is the strategic truth of it. But strategy is not what a spring is to the woman who goes to it. To her, it is the first errand of the day, and one of the heaviest. And it is also, and this matters, the 1 hour when she is out of the house and among the others. Water in that world is not something that arrives. It is something that is carried by hand, in a jar, on the shoulder, or balanced on a pad on the head, up a slope several times a day, for the whole of a life. And the carrying is women's work, and always was, everywhere around that sea, without exception. A full jar is a serious weight. You feel it in the neck and the lower back. And the bones of these women show it, the same way they show the grinding. So picture the way down to the spring in the grey of the morning. A worn path, the stone of it, polished by generations of bare and sandaled feet, going down to where the water comes up cold out of the hill. And along it, in the half-light, the women, with their empty jars, going down light and coming back bent, and at the water itself, a gathering. Because you cannot fill a jar instantly, and there is a queue, and a queue of women who have known each other their whole lives is not a silent thing. This is where the city talked. This is where you heard that a child 3 houses along had the fever, that a ship had come in below with something worth seeing, that somebody's daughter was to be married at the next feast, that somebody's mother had died in the night. The news of that city moved through the women at the water before it moved anywhere else, and the men heard most of it, later, from them. And there were the young ones, sent down with a small jar, because a girl is never too young to begin carrying, learning the path and the weight and the talk all at once, listening to the older women the way children do, taking in far more than anyone means them to. And there were the very old, who could no longer manage a full jar up the slope, but who came down anyway, for the company, and filled a small one, and stood in the cool and were part of it. A woman's whole life was on that path, from the girl with the little jar to the grandmother with the small one, and in the middle of it the years of the full jar. The heavy years, up and down, before the sun was properly up. We do not think of water as a luxury, and they did not think of it as anything at all, which is exactly the point. It was simply there, cold at the bottom of the path, and getting it was simply what you did. And the getting of it was woven so completely into the shape of a woman's day that she would no more have remarked on it than you would remark on turning a tap. But it is one of the truest things I can give you about that city. Before the looms started, before the men went out to the boats and the wall, in the first grey light, the women of Troy went down to the water together and came back up under the weight of it. And that was the beginning of every single day for 3,000 years. So there is the first errand of the day already done, down at the water, in the grey. Now walk the rest of it with me, because we have the pieces, and I want to set them in order. From that first light, all the way down to the dark. It is dark when it starts. There is no lie-in for anybody in the Bronze Age. You get up when the sky greys. Because light is the only thing you have, and there is not enough of it. The lamps are small, and they burn oil, and oil is expensive, so almost nothing happens after sunset, except sleep and talk, and if you are lucky, a fire. So the day begins in the grey, and the first sound in that city, in every house on that hill, every morning, for 500 years, is the same. Stone on stone, somebody is grinding. It is a hard, rhythmic, scraping noise, and there are thousands of them going at once, all over the citadel and all down through the lower town. Because everybody has to eat, and bread has to be made this morning and cannot be made in advance. Then the fires, smoke coming up out of a few hundred roofs at once, and hanging, because the wind takes it sideways, bread on the hot stones or in a domed clay oven. Animals moving, goats going out to the plain, dogs at the doors, and the water already going up the slope on the women's shoulders, the first errand of the day long since begun. And then the looms, all day. Standing. That is the thing to hold on to about weaving on an upright loom. You do not sit at it, you stand in front of it, and you walk side to side, passing the weft, and reach up, and beat the row down with a comb or a sword-shaped beater, and then do it again, and the cloth grows perhaps a hand's breadth in a day, if you are good, and you do not stop. The room is full of women doing this, and it is not silent. Weaving is one of the great sociable labours of the ancient world, because your hands are busy, and your mouth is not. And so the room is full of talk and singing and children underfoot, and the click of the beater and the small knock of the weights swinging against each other when the warp moves. That sound. Thousands of small clay weights, knocking gently all day. In every house on that hill, outside, the city, men doing what men do, the animals, the boats, the trade, the wall, merchants up from the bay with things to sell and nothing to do until the wind turns. Somebody hammering bronze, dogs, and beyond the gate the town keeps going, all the way out to the ditch and the palisade, and past that the plain, and the river and the bay, with the ships sitting in it waiting. Then the light goes off the water from the west, and everything stops, because it must. The looms stop, the fires bank, the goats come in, and that is the day. And in the morning, in the grey, somebody starts grinding again, and I want to give you the night, because we have spent all of that day out in the light on that hill, and the night is where you and I actually are. There is no artificial light worth the name. That is the fact that reorganizes everything. There are lamps, small ones, clay, a wick floating in oil, and they give roughly what a candle gives, which is enough to find something in a room and not enough to work by. And oil is money. So nobody in that city is burning oil for pleasure, and no one is up late over a book, because there are no books, and the skill of reading does not exist here. When the sun goes down over the water, and it goes down over the water, there straight out west across the bay, the day is finished. Everything stops. The looms stop, because you cannot see the thread. The grinding stops. The gates shut. And then it is dark in a way that almost no one now living has experienced. Not dim. Dark. There is no glow on the horizon from anywhere, because there is nowhere for a glow to come from. The nearest city of any kind is across a sea. The whole plain goes black, and the bay goes black, and the only lights in the entire world are a few red points where somebody has a fire banked, and the stars, which in that air, on that hill, with no moon, are not the handful you can see from a town, but the whole of it, the full sky, dense, the Milky Way lying across it like a smear of chalk, so bright that things have shadows. They knew that sky far better than we know ours. They had to. It was the calendar and the clock and the compass all in one, and a sailor's life depended on it, and a farmer's year was set by it. When a particular star rises just before dawn, plough. When another one does, harvest. The poem is full of it. There is a shield in the Iliad with the constellations on it, named, and the Great Bear is on it, and Homer says she alone never bathes in the sea, which is his way of saying that in that latitude the bear never sets and everything else does, which is true, and which is exactly what you know if you have spent your life outdoors in the dark. So hold this against the fire that is coming, because it is just as true and it lasted a great deal longer. An ordinary night, 400 years before anything went wrong. The gates are shut. The city is dark on its hill above a black plain, The wind has dropped a little, the way it sometimes does after sunset. And in the houses, in the long rooms, the looms are standing in the dark with the day's work on them. Half done, the weights hanging still, waiting for the light. And everyone in that city is asleep, all 5,000 of them, or 10,000, under the whole enormous sky, 3,200 years ago. And they are absolutely certain that tomorrow is going to be the same as today. The year had a shape, and it is not our shape, and it is worth having, because it governs everything that happens in this story, including when a war can be fought. The sea closes. That is the first thing. In the ancient Mediterranean, nobody sails in winter, and I mean nobody. The sailing season runs from roughly the spring to roughly the autumn, and outside it the sea is shut. Because the weather is genuinely lethal to an open boat, and there is no way to see where you are going. So the whole rhythm of that world is seasonal in a way, ours is not. From about November to about March, the ships stop. The ships in the bay below Troy go home, or are hauled out and sit on the beach. Trade stops. News stops. Whatever is happening anywhere else, you will not hear about it until spring. And war stops, absolutely, which is one more reason the 10-year siege of the poem cannot have happened as described. An army cannot be supplied across a closed sea. They would have gone home every autumn and come back, if they came back at all. So the year opens in spring, and the wind comes back, and the first sail appears in the strait, and the whole city wakes up because the business is starting again. Summer is the season, hot, dry, the wind hard from the north nearly every day, the bay full of ships that cannot get up the channel, the town full of men with money, the looms going. The harvest comes in high summer, and then the olives much later, in the autumn, and the grapes between. Every one of those is a scramble, all hands, everybody out. Because a harvest is a thing that has to happen in a particular week, and if it does not, you starve in February, and then the sea shuts, and the city turns inward for 4 months. That is the winter. And the winter is the loom season. It is the time when there is not much else to do, and it is dark early, and it is wet, and the wind is worse, and everybody is inside, and the cloth gets made. All the raw wool from the spring shearing has been washed and combed by now, and the spinning has been going all year because spinning never stops, and so the winter is when it goes on the frame. In the light of whatever door or window you have, in a room with everybody in it, which is why, when the Greeks came, they came in summer. And it is why, if you were a woman on that hill and your city was going to be taken, the odds are that it happened in the warm months, with the wind up and the cloth on the loom half finished. And that when the ships went home in the autumn, you went with them across a sea that was about to close behind you for the winter. Now come down to the shore with me, at midday, with the wind blowing hard through the fortnight it has now been blowing, and the bay full of ships that cannot leave. Because that crowded strand is the strangest and most colourful thing about living in that city, and it is the thing that made everyone in it rich. You remember the wind. It comes down the strait from the north, hard, most days, and a ship with a square sail cannot get up against it. And so the ships pile up in the bay below the city and wait for it to turn, and it does not turn, and they wait. And a ship full of men with nothing to do, and a hold full of cargo is not going to sit quietly on a beach. They come ashore. And so below the walls, on the strand, for weeks at a stretch, there is a kind of permanent involuntary fair, made of crews from up and down that sea, waiting for a wind that will not come, and spending, because there is nothing else to do. Imagine the sound of it first, because that is what would reach you before anything else, coming down from the gate. Voices, a great many of them, and not all in the same language, because the men on that beach have come from everywhere the sea touches. There is the tongue of the mainland Greeks, and the tongues of the islands, and the speech of the Anatolian coast, and traders from further east and south, whose words nobody on that beach can follow at all, and business is done anyway. the way it always has been, in gestures and held up fingers and coins and the raising of eyebrows. There is laughter, and there is argument, and there is the particular flat music of men haggling, which is the same in every language and every century, and the colour. This is a grey and brown and white world for the most part, all stone and mud brick and undyed wool and sun-bleached wood. And then down on that strand there is everything the sea has carried in. Bolts of cloth in colours that cost a fortune, copper, red gold in the sun, jars of oil and wine, baskets of what does not grow here, dried fish and strange fruit and resin that smells of somewhere else, skins, timber, and the one thing this place sells, its own famous cloth, carried down from the looms on the hill, purple bordered, the most costly bolt on the beach, folded and shown and folded away again. And the smell, which is the sea and the fish and the smoke of 100 cooking fires and the animals and the particular reek drifting from somewhere downwind, of the vats where the purple is made, and under all of it, the hot tar and salt smell of the boats themselves, drawn up on the sand, leaning, with men asleep in whatever shade they throw. Now here is the part that belongs to the women, because you might think a beach full of foreign sailors is a man's world, and mostly it was. But the cloth on that beach, the thing worth more than the copper, came off the looms in the houses on the hill, and it was made by women, and some of them will have come down to see it sold, or to sell it, and to see the ships, and the strangers, and the goods from the far side of the world, laid out on the sand. It was, I suspect, one of the great sights of a Trojan woman's year, the crowded shore in a long north wind, the whole sea washed up and waiting below her city. And she would climb back up to the gate afterwards, and up the terraces to her own door, and pick the shuttle back up, and the thing she was weaving was all ready before it was finished, spoken for by a man down on that beach who would carry it away to a country she would never see, and she knew it, and she wove the border a little finer for it. And now go back to the poem, and read it again with the loom weights in your hand, because it is a different poem. Every woman in the Iliad is at a loom. Every single one. It is not a passing detail, it is where they are, structurally. Whenever the poem goes indoors. And the first time we meet Helen, the most famous woman in the history of the world, the face that launched the ships, the cause of the whole catastrophe. She is not on a balcony, and she is not in a bed. She is weaving, and what she is weaving is the war. Homer says she is working a great purple cloth, a double width, and putting into it the battles of the Trojans and the Achaeans, the fighting they are suffering for her sake. She is at a loom, in purple, making a tapestry of her own war. That is the first thing we ever see her do. Sit with that for a second, alongside 10 kilograms of murex shells and a hillside of loom weights, and tell me the tradition is not carrying something. And then Andromache, who is the one who breaks my heart, Hector's wife. In the last book of the fighting, while her husband is outside the wall being run down and killed by Achilles, Homer takes us into her house. And she does not know. Nobody has told her. And she is at the loom, in an inner room, weaving a purple cloth and working flowers into it. And she has just called to her women to put a great cauldron on the fire, because she wants a hot bath ready for Hector when he comes in from the fighting. She is warming his bath, and then she hears the noise from the wall, and the shuttle falls out of her hand onto the floor, and she runs. That is the most devastating image in the poem, and it is made entirely out of housework. The shuttle hitting the floor. Homer does not describe her grief. He tells you she dropped a small wooden object, and the sound it made. And 3,000 years later, it still works. And here is the thing I keep turning over. In 1930-something, Carl Blegan, digging that hill for the University of Cincinnati, went into a house of that period that had burned. And in the burned layer he found the collapsed remains of a loom. The wood was gone, but the fire had left its record, and the weights were lying where they fell, in a line, in the ash, in the order they had hung in. He lifted them out one at a time and wrote down exactly where each of them had lain. A loom in a burned house at Troy at the end of the Bronze Age, with the weights lying where they dropped. I'm not going to tell you that is Andromache's loom, because it is not, and because the honest position is that we do not know whether Andromache ever existed, and probably she did not. But somebody was standing at that loom, a real woman, with a name we will never learn, was working on that cloth in that room on that hill, and something happened, and she left it, and the house came down burning on top of it. And the weights lay in the ash for 3,100 years, until a man from Ohio brushed the dirt off them and found them still in their row. The poem gives you the image. The ground gives you the loom. And whatever the relationship between the two of them is, and it is a genuinely hard question that serious people argue about, something got carried from one to the other across 400 years of darkness. And what got carried was not the kings, and it was not the battles. What got carried was a woman at a loom, and the sound of a shuttle hitting the floor. And Andromache. I keep coming back to her, and I am going to let myself, because if this evening has a person in it, it is her. And she is not a queen, and she does not do anything, and that is exactly the point. She is Hector's wife. She is not from Troy. She came there in marriage from a city called Thebe, under a mountain, some way down the coast, and Achilles had already sacked that city before the poem begins. He killed her father there, and he killed her 7 brothers, all of them in one day, and her mother was taken and ransomed and then died anyway. So by the time we meet her, everything she came from is already gone, and the man standing in front of her is all she has, and she says so in the scene at the gate. In one of the lines that has never lost its power, she tells him that he is her father now, and her mother, and her brother, and her husband, all of it, and asks him not to go out. He goes out. Of course, he goes out. And Homer, who is not a cruel writer, but is an honest one, does not give her the moment. She does not see it happen. She is in the house, in an inner room, at the loom, weaving a purple cloth with flowers in it. And she has just told the women to put the cauldron on, because he will want a hot bath when he comes in. And the poem says, in a line that I think is the most devastating aside in literature, that she was foolish and knew nothing, because he was already dead. She is warming the bath of a man who has been dead for some time. That is the whole thing. That is what it is. And then the noise, and the shuttle on the floor, and she runs, and she goes up on the tower, and she looks out, and she sees, and afterwards, in the plays, we know what happens to her. And it is exactly what happened to every woman in that city, and to the women in the Pylos tablets. She is allotted. She goes to the son of the man who killed her husband and destroyed her family, which is a detail so brutal that even the Greeks seem slightly shocked by it. Her child is taken and killed because a boy is a risk. And she goes to Greece and lives a long time and has other children by the man who owns her, and that is the end of her story. She survives, which is worse. There was no Andromache, but in the burned layer of that hill there is a room, and in that room there was a loom, and it fell, and the weights are lying in the ash in the order they hung in, which means that whoever was standing in front of it walked away from unfinished work and did not come back for it. Somebody was warming something. Somebody had a plan for that afternoon. And whatever came through that door, she did not finish the cloth. And 3,000 years later, a man from Minnesota knelt down in the ash and found the place where she had been standing. So let us go into one of those houses, because we have them. The best preserved late Bronze Age houses at Troy are the ones just outside the citadel wall, which survived by a lovely accident. The Greeks and Romans, centuries later, dumped their rubbish and their building spoil over the side of the hill, and it landed on top of these houses and sealed them, and so they sat in the dark under 1,000 years of somebody else's rubble, in the shadow of the Great Wall, waiting. They are not what you would expect. They are large. A good Trojan house of that period is a long rectangular building, and the plan is one that would have been perfectly familiar to a Greek of Homer's day. You come in at the short end, through a porch with columns, into one long high room with a hearth in the middle of the floor. That central hall, with the fire in the middle and the roof open above it to let the smoke out, is the heart of the house, and it is where everything happens. And it is the same room, essentially, that the poem calls the Megaron, and that the Mycenaean palaces across the water were building at the same time. Around it are smaller chambers, storage, sleeping, and the women's quarters where the looms would stand. The walls are stone at the base, and mud brick above, plastered, and in the good houses they were painted. The roof is flat or shallow, timber and reed and packed clay, and the floors are beaten earth, swept, hard as concrete after a generation of feet. And into those floors, in the last phase of the city, somebody sank the storage jars. This is one of the most eloquent things on the site, and we will come back to it, because it is the whole ending in a single archaeological detail. What was in the house? Ordinary things, and this is where the museum is a gift, because they have it all. Grinding stones, which is where a great deal of a woman's day went. Because grain does not become bread without somebody kneeling and pushing a stone back and forth for hours. And the skeletons of Bronze Age women all over the Mediterranean show it. In their knees and their toes and their backs. Tripod cooking pots that stand in the embers on their own legs. Bowls, jugs, plates, lids, spindle whorls, needles. And in the food itself, what the environmental work turns up is the standard triad of that entire world: wheat and barley and olives and the vine, bread, oil, wine, legumes, beans and lentils and chickpeas, sheep and goat, mostly, which is what you keep on that landscape, and pig and cattle, which are wealth rather than dinner, fish from the strait, shellfish, and the great fact of ancient life, which is that meat was rare and mostly came at a sacrifice, so that eating an animal was a religious occasion, and the smell of roasting in that city meant a god was being fed first. Let us eat, because I have said bread and oil and wine and moved on, and food is the most intimate thing there is. Bread first, always, because bread is most of the calories of most of the people for the whole of antiquity. Wheat if you are doing well, barley if you are not, and barley is far more common than the poets admit, because barley grows where wheat will not, and does not mind a dry year. It comes to the table as a flat loaf off a hot stone or out of a domed clay oven, and it is coarse, and it is gritty, and I mean that literally. Grinding grain between two stones puts stone dust into the flour. Every day, at every meal, for life. And you can see the result on the teeth of anybody from that period, which are worn flat by the time they are 40. Everything they ate had sand in it. Nobody remarked on it, because there was nothing to compare it to. Then oil. Olive oil is not a condiment in that world. It is a foundation. It is the fat. It is the fuel for the lamp. It is the soap. It is the skin cream. It is the medicine base. And it is a major export. And wine, watered, which everybody drinks, including children. Partly because it is safer than the water, and mostly because it is what there is. Beyond that, beans, lentils, chickpeas, which are the protein of ordinary people and are in the pot most days. Onions and garlic. Greens gathered wild, which is a habit that has never died in that part of the world. There are old women on that coast today, walking the field edges in spring, picking the same plants. Figs, fresh in season and dried for the winter. And dried figs are so important that they are the standard ration in the Linear B tablets alongside grain. Grain and figs, month after month, for hundreds of women. Honey, which is the only sweetness there is, and meat. Rarely. This is the thing that is hardest for us. Meat was not dinner. Meat was an event, and the event was religious. You did not simply kill a sheep because you fancied it. You killed it at an altar, and the god got the smoke and the fat and the bones, and the people got the rest. And eating meat was therefore inseparable from worship. So the smell of roasting in that city meant a festival. And everybody knew it, and everybody came. Sheep and goat mostly, some pig, and cattle very seldom, because a cow is capital. Fish and shellfish from the strait, in quantity, which the poets are oddly snobbish about, but the rubbish heaps are full of. That is the Trojan table. Flat gritty bread, oil, watered wine, a bean pot, an onion, figs, and 11 times a year. A piece of roast lamb that had to be given to a god before anybody was allowed to touch it, and the horses. This is the one that pleases me most, because Homer has a stock phrase he uses for the Trojans over and over. Hippodamoi, horse tamers. The Trojans, breakers of horses. It is practically their surname in the poem, and it is the very last word of the Iliad. The poem ends on it, and when the excavators went through the animal bone from the site, they found something that changes exactly the right moment. In the levels of Troy VI, when that great walled city goes up, horse bones appear, and they appear in quantity, and before that, they are essentially not there at all. Horses arrive at Troy with the Bronze Age city, and they are all through it. Now a horse in that period is not transport, it is not a farm animal. Nobody is riding it into battle either. That comes much later. A horse is a chariot engine and a status object, and it is fabulously expensive to keep, because a horse eats grain, which is to say, a horse eats the food of several people, every day, forever. Keeping horses is a way of announcing that you are so rich you can afford to feed your animals what your neighbours eat. And the plain below Troy is grass, and the wind is good, and the Trojans were horse people, and the poem remembered, and the bones agree. And the last word of the Iliad is horse tamer. That is the thing about this site that gets under your skin. It is never the big claims that land. The wooden horse is not there, and never will be. But the wall leans, and there are horse bones from the right layer, and the ditch would stop a chariot, and the women are at the looms. The poem is wrong about everything that matters, and uncannily right about the furniture, the animals next, and the land, because a city is not only its people. And the sounds, and the beasts, and the plain around that hill were as much a part of what it was like to be there as any wall. And they are the part that returns at night, when the human noise dies down. Begin with the goats, because the goats are the constant. A goat gives milk and hair and meat, and will eat more or less anything on that dry landscape. And they were everywhere, and the sound of a herd of goats moving, that complaining, bleating, bell-knocking sound. Going out in the morning and coming back at dusk is one of the oldest sounds of the Mediterranean, and it has not changed at all. Sheep for the wool, which is the whole foundation of the city's wealth, out on the grass of the plain in their flocks. Pigs, kept close, which will eat the scraps and turn them into meat and ask nothing but food. Cattle, fewer, because a cow is wealth, slow and valuable, kept for the plough and the cart, and for the great occasions when one would be killed. And the oxen at the ploughing, enormous and patient, leaning into the yoke, turning the heavy soil of the plain in the spring, with a man walking behind them, talking to them the way men have always talked to working animals, low and steady and mostly nonsense. And the horses, which we have spoken of, out on the plain, because the plain below Troy is grass, and grass is what a horse needs. And the Trojans were horse people, and the poem never forgot it. A horse on that plain is a rich man's creature, glossy and fed on grain that would have fed a family, and to see a team of them at a run, drawing a light car across the flat ground, was to see the wealth of the city made into motion. And the dogs, every settlement of that world ran with dogs, and they were not pets in the way we mean. They were half wild, and they worked, guarding the flocks, guarding the doors, cleaning up what was dropped, barking the alarm in the night. A city like that one had a voice after dark, and a great deal of it was dogs, one starting somewhere down in the lower town, and the whole hill answering, and then falling quiet, and then starting again. And beyond the wall, beyond the ditch, beyond the last of the houses, the plain and the two rivers crossing it, and the marsh where they met the old bay, thick with birds, herons and ducks, and the waders, rising in clouds at dawn. And past that the high country, where the wild began, real and close, in a way it is not for us. There were wolves, there were boar in the thickets, dangerous, hunted. There were the big cats of that age, rarer, but there, in the poems, up in the folds of the hills. And after dark, when the gates were shut, and the dogs had finally quieted, and the fires were banked, the people behind that wall could hear, sometimes, carrying across the plain, the cries of what lived out beyond it. And they pulled the shutters too, and were glad of the wall. And the wall was not only for armies, it was for the wild itself, and what moved in it, and the oldest fear there is, which is the fear of what waits past the last of the firelight. Their wall stood good against it, and behind it the looms fell still and waited for morning. Come back inside now for two small things about the objects, because they are the sort of detail that makes a place real. The first is the pottery, which sounds like the dullest possible subject, and is in fact the backbone of everything, because pottery is how archaeology tells time. Fashions in pots change constantly, and pots break constantly, and fired clay lasts forever. So a hill like that one is full of broken pots at every level, and each level's pots look slightly different from the one below it. And once you have worked out the sequence, you can date a layer by its rubbish. The whole chronology of Troy, all 9 cities of it, is built on smashed crockery, and Troy's own pottery has a character. Through the Bronze Age they made, in enormous quantities, a distinctive greyware, fine, well-made, wheel-thrown, burnished to a soft sheen, in a range from pale ash to nearly black. It is quite beautiful, and it is theirs, and you find it up and down that coast, because they were exporting it. And alongside it in the good houses, the imports, Mycenaean cups and jars from across the water, painted, glossy, with their octopuses and their spirals, which is how we know exactly how long the Greeks had been coming. And the answer is centuries, peacefully. Buying and selling, generation after generation, right up until they were not. The second thing is smaller, and I like it more. They found spindle walls at Troy in enormous numbers, as I said, and many of them are decorated, incised by hand with patterns, dots, circles, zigzags, little suns. Now, a spindle wall is a disc of clay with a hole in it that goes on the end of a stick and makes it turn. It is a tool. It is the most utilitarian object imaginable. It costs nothing. It is worth nothing. And if it breaks you, make another one in 10 minutes. There is absolutely no reason to decorate a spindle wall. It does not spin better for having a pattern on it. And they decorated them anyway. Somebody in that city, 3,000 years ago, sat down with the cheapest and most ordinary object in her working life, the thing she would hold in her hand for hours every day of her life, and scratched a pattern into it. Because she wanted it to be nice, and it is still nice. It is in a case, in a museum, in Canakkale, and you can go and look at the marks she made. That is the thing I would take away from that hill. If I could only take one, not the wall, not the gold, a woman making her tools pretty, for no reason at all except that she was going to be holding them for the rest of her life. And what did they wear, since they were making the cloth? It is a fair question, and the answer is frustrating, and then, at the very edge, lovely. Frustrating first. Dot cloth does not survive. That is the tragedy at the centre of all of this. The single most important product of that entire civilization, the stuff the women spent their lives making, the one commodity worth more than silver, rots. It rots completely in a few years in that soil. So we have thousands of loom weights and not one thread of what was on the looms. We have the tools of an industry and none of its output. The murex shells survive and the purple does not. It is a cruel arrangement, and it means that the most valuable objects in Bronze Age Troy are the ones we will never see, and the least valuable, the clay lumps and the broken pots, are the ones we have by the crate. So we work sideways. From the loom weights themselves, which tell you a surprising amount, the weight of the weight tells you the tension, and the tension tells you the thickness of the thread, and the thickness of the thread tells you the fineness of the cloth. And the Trojan weights are, many of them, light, which means fine thread, which means good cloth, not sacking. From art elsewhere in that world, the Minoans and Mycenaeans painted people, and we can see flounced skirts and open bodices and elaborate patterning, though whether a Trojan woman looked anything like a Cretan fresco is anybody's guess. From the pins and the brooches, which do survive in bronze, and which tell you the garment was pinned at the shoulder rather than sewn, which in turn tells you it was essentially a large rectangle draped and fastened, because that is what you make on an upright loom, and cutting good cloth up is a waste. From the needles, which are there, so there was sewing. From the Hittite texts, which mention textiles constantly, so the honest picture, woolen, in the main, and linen, where they could get flax. A rectangle of cloth, pinned, belted, over a longer undergarment, patterned at the edges, because the borders are where the weaver shows what she can do, and Homer says exactly that about Andromache, working flowers into hers. Colour, yes, and more than you think, because they had madder and weld and woad and all the ordinary plant dyes. So reds and yellows and blues and browns, and at the very top, purple, on the people who could afford the VAT. And here is the lovely bit at the edge. That fine thread, and those light weights, and the flowers in the borders, and the decorated walls all say the same thing. Quietly. Across 3,000 years. These were not people making cloth to be warm. They were making it to be looked at. Somebody on that hill cared what the border looked like. She was working in a room with a fire in the middle, and a hole in the roof, on a hill above a windy plain, in a city that was going to burn, and she was thinking about the pattern. Let me draw all of it together into a single life. One ordinary woman of that city, not a queen, and not a name we will ever know, only the kind of woman that Hill was full of, so that you can carry one whole shape of a life away with you rather than a scatter of facts. She is invented, in the sense that I am giving you no single real person. She is entirely true, in the sense that everything in her life is something we know was true of the women there. She is born in one of the houses on the terraces, or more likely in one of the smaller houses of the lower town. And she is lucky, because a third of the children born around her will not see 5, and she does. Her earliest world is the floor of the great room, the hearth in the middle of it, the loom standing against the wall with her mother in front of it, the knock of the weights, the smell of wool and wood smoke and bread. She learns to walk on a beaten earth floor, packed hard as stone. And under that floor, quite possibly, is a younger brother or sister who did not live, buried there, kept close, and she grows up knowing it and thinking nothing strange about it. Because that is simply how it is. She is spinning before she is 6. Everyone spins all the time, and a child's hands are set to it early. And her first thread is uneven and gets better. She goes to the water with the other girls and learns the path and the weight. She learns the loom, standing at her mother's side, and by the time she is a young woman, she can weave, and the cloth she makes goes into the store, because it is hers, it is her worth. It is what she will bring. She marries in her middle teens, by torchlight, and carries her cloth across the city to another house, and cries to leave her mother even as she is glad. And both are real. And then the long middle of her life begins, and it is the loom and the grinding stone and the water and the fire, and it is children. She is pregnant, on and off, for most of the years that follow, and each of those is a danger she walks into, without any medicine behind her at all, and she knows women who did not come through it. And one year she may very nearly not come through it herself. She bears more children than will live. She buries some of them. She goes back to the loom, because the cloth still has to be made. And the going back to the loom is not coldness. It is the only thing there is to do, and her hands know it, even when the rest of her is somewhere else. Her body wears in the particular way that body wore. Her knees and her back carry the grinding. Her hands are a spinner's hands and a weaver's hands. Her arms are far stronger than you would think to look at her, stronger than the arms of most men you have known. Because she has spent her life at the hardest sustained work in the settlement. And she is not old, by our reckoning, when she begins to be old. 40 is old. Many did not reach it. If she does, she becomes one of the older women, and her place shifts, and she is listened to, and she sings the coarse songs at the weddings now, and makes the young brides blush. And she carries the small jar down to the water for the company of it, and she has daughters and their daughters around her at the loom. And if she is fortunate, she dies in her own house, in her own time, with her own people around her, and is carried out and buried properly beyond the walls, which is the thing that mattered more than almost anything, to be buried properly by your own. And her daughters take her place at the loom, and her granddaughters are already spinning their first uneven thread, and the cloth goes on. She has no name for us, and no monument. But she left something in the ground, in the ash of the burned houses, and the fill of the abandoned ones. The weights she hung on her warp, and the wall she spun with, and those we have in their thousands. And they are the truest thing anyone in that city left behind. And they are hers. That is the place then, and the women who were the true engine of it. But no town on that strait ever stood alone. And to understand why this one came to burn, we have to leave the loom room now and look outward, at the sea and the strangers on it, and the wider web of trade Troy sat in the middle of. A city that lives on a strait lives on other people's cargo, and the late Bronze Age Mediterranean was far more connected than most people imagine. This was not a scatter of isolated villages. It was a world with an international system in it. Egypt and the Hittites and Babylon and Assyria and the Mycenaeans, all of them in constant contact, all of them writing to each other, all of them trading, in a network that ran from the Baltic amber routes down to the Nile and east to Afghanistan. We know exactly how good that trade was because of a shipwreck. Off the southern coast of Turkey, at a place called Uluburun, a sponge diver in the 1980s, saw what he described as metal biscuits, with ears lying on the seabed. And what he had found was a late Bronze Age merchant ship that went down around 1300 before the Common Era, with everything still in it. The manifest is astonishing. 10 tons of copper in ingots, shaped exactly like a hide stretched out, which is what the diver had seen. A ton of tin, which is the rare half of bronze and had to come from a very long way away. Glass ingots, cobalt blue, ebony from Africa, ivory, both elephant and hippopotamus. Ostrich eggshells, amber from the Baltic, which is to say from northern Europe, on a ship in the eastern Mediterranean. Terebinth resin by the hundredweight for incense. Figs, olives, pomegranates, coriander. Gold, a scarab with the name of an Egyptian queen on it, and the crew's own things, their pots, their weights, their lamps, and a folding wooden writing tablet, the oldest book in the world. That ship went past Troy's coast. Or ships exactly like it did, constantly. And that is the world Troy sat in the doorway of, and the reason the wind mattered so much. Everything in that manifest, if it was going north, had to stop at the mouth of that channel and wait. And so what you find at Troy is a place with its fingers in everything and a character all its own. The pottery is largely local, a grey ware they made themselves and made well. But there is Mycenaean pottery in the layers too. From across the water, in quantity. So the Greeks were there, trading, for generations before anything went wrong. There is Cypriot material. There is the odd Egyptian thing. Troy is not Greek, and it is not Hittite. It is its own thing. An Anatolian city facing west, speaking, in all probability, a language called Luwian, dealing with everybody, belonging to nobody, and doing very nicely. We should meet the people on the other side of the water, because the Greeks of that age are not the Greeks you are thinking of either, and the difference matters. Homer's Achaeans and the Ahiyawa of the Hittite letters are the Mycenaeans, and they are a genuinely strange civilization. They were named after Mycenae in the northeast of the Peloponnese, which was the greatest of their citadels, and they were not a country. They were a scatter of independent palace kingdoms, each on its own hill, each behind its own wall, and the walls are the thing that stays with you. They built in what later Greeks called Cyclopean masonry, which is a wonderful term and means exactly what it sounds like. When the classical Greeks looked at these walls, standing in ruins in their own countryside, made of unmortared blocks weighing several tons each, they concluded that no human being could possibly have moved them and that the giants must have done it. They had forgotten their own ancestors had built those walls, and 4 centuries later, they had no memory of it at all and assumed it was monsters. That is how complete the Dark Age was. And they were, by any reasonable description, a warrior aristocracy that had got organised. Their art is full of fighting and hunting. Their graves are full of weapons. When Schliemann dug at Mycenae, he found shaft graves with gold everywhere, and a gold death mask he immediately announced was Agamemnon, which it is not, being some 3 centuries too early, but the man could not help himself. And the palaces were run as intensely bureaucratic redistribution machines, which is what the Linear B tells us. Everything measured, everything counted, wool weighed out to named workers, and the finished cloth weighed back in, an economy of clerks and quotas and receipts. So the picture is this. Across that sea from Troy, for a couple of centuries, there were perhaps a dozen of these fortified palace states, aggressive, rich, well-armed, obsessive record keepers, running a textile industry of their own that needed a constant supply of labour and entirely capable of putting a fleet together. They traded with Troy for generations. Their pottery is all through the layers, and they had, on the evidence of their own accounts, women from the Anatolian coast working their wool. And then their world ended too, in the same 50 years. Every one of those palaces was destroyed or abandoned. Mycenae burned. Pylos burned, and the fire baked the tablets that told us all of this, including the last of them, which are about watchers being posted along the coast to look at the sea. Whatever came for Troy came for them as well, more or less at once, and nobody has ever satisfactorily explained it. The winners and the losers of that war, if there was a war, went into the ground together within a lifetime of each other. What they worshipped on that hill is a harder question than it looks, and the honest answer is that we know less than we would like. The poem is very clear about it. Athena has a temple in the citadel, with a seated statue in it, and the Trojan women go up there in procession and lay a robe across the goddess's knees and beg her to have mercy on the city, and she refuses. Apollo is on the Trojan side throughout, and so is Aphrodite, and that is Homer's answer. But Homer's Trojans are, religiously, simply Greeks. They sacrifice like Greeks, they pray to the same gods with the same names, and there is not a hint anywhere in the poem that these people are foreign, which is charming and completely wrong. The real Troy was an Anatolian city in the Hittite sphere, and its gods will have been Anatolian gods with Anatolian names. And if you had put a Mycenaean and a Trojan in a room together, they would very likely have needed an interpreter, and would certainly have needed one to discuss religion. What we actually have is scraps, and they are tantalizing. There is a great weather god across that whole world, standing on a bull with a lightning bolt, who is the chief god of the Hittites and of most of Anatolia, and who has many names. There is a mother goddess, everywhere, in every period, from the deep prehistory of that peninsula, right through to the Romans, and she outlasts everything. In the Alexandru Treaty itself, the divine witnesses on the Wilusan side are listed, as they always are in those documents, and the reading of them is difficult and disputed, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But the point is that Troy had its own gods, and they were written down, and they are not Greek ones. And on the hill they have found things that are plainly religious and stubbornly silent. There are standing stones, worked pillars, set upright outside the gates, and nobody can tell you with certainty what they were for, though the guess is that they represented gods without depicting them, which is an idea with a very long life in that part of the world. There are votive deposits. There is what may be a sanctuary in the lower town, but we cannot read any of it, because Troy did not write. That is the thing to hold on to. This city, for all its wealth and all its walls, has produced almost nothing written. There is one small seal with a bit of Louisiana on it, and that is very nearly the lot. So we know the gods of their overlords, and the gods their conquerors' descendants later imagined for them, and of what those particular people, on that particular hill, actually knelt to and asked for and were afraid of. We have almost nothing at all. They prayed for 3,000 years on that spot, and we cannot hear a word of it. And one last correction, because I have been calling them Trojans all evening, and you may have a picture of them that is quietly wrong. They were not Greeks. Homer's Trojans are Greeks in everything but their address. They speak Greek without comment, they pray to Greek gods with Greek names, they sacrifice the Greek way, they have Greek manners, and nobody in the poem ever needs an interpreter. Which is such a strange oversight in a work otherwise so observant that it must be deliberate or unconscious rather than ignorant, and it is charming, and it is one of the reasons the poem works so well. Because it means the enemy is not alien, the enemy is us, on the other side of a field, and Hector is more sympathetic than any Greek in it. The reality is that Troy was Anatolian. It sat in the Hittite sphere, it answered to a Hittite king, its people almost certainly spoke Luwian, which is an Indo-European language related to Hittite and entirely unrelated to Greek in any way a speaker would notice. Their material culture is their own. Their grey pottery is not Mycenaean pottery. Their house plans are their own tradition. Their gods are Anatolian gods. Genetically and culturally, they belong to that peninsula. And their eyes were on the Hittite world to the east, as much as on the Aegean to the west. A Trojan and a Mycenaean in a room together were two foreigners, and if they did business, they did it through a third language or through gesture and arithmetic, the way traders have always done it. So the war, if there was a war, was not a civil war between two branches of the same people. It was a raid across a cultural frontier by people who spoke a different language, on a city that belonged to a different world, and the poem's beautiful even-handedness, in which both sides are the same and both are worth mourning, is a thing, Homer added. It is not a memory. It is a decision. And I find that more moving, not less. Because whoever made that choice was working 400 years after the fact, in a Greek tradition for Greek audiences, about the greatest Greek triumph in the whole store of stories. And he looked at the enemy, the foreigners, the ones on the other side of the wall who spoke another language and prayed to other gods, and he decided to give them the best man in the poem, and the best marriage, and the only decent goodbye, and to end the whole thing not with the Greeks winning, but with a Trojan father getting his son's body back. Nobody made him do that. Nobody in his audience required it. He just did it. We call it the Bronze Age so casually that it is worth stopping on the bronze, because the metal explains the politics, and it explains why that shipwreck was carrying what it was carrying. Bronze is an alloy. It is copper with a little tin in it, roughly 9 parts to 1, and that small addition changes everything. Copper on its own is soft and nearly useless for a blade, and bronze is hard and takes an edge and holds it. Weapons, tools, razors, cauldrons, armor. In that world, all of it is bronze. It is the material the entire age is built out of and named after. And here is the problem that shaped that whole civilization. Copper is common enough. There was a great deal of it on Cyprus, which is where the island's name comes from, and it moved around in those hide-shaped ingots by the ton. But tin is rare. Tin is genuinely, awkwardly rare. and there is essentially none of it anywhere in the eastern Mediterranean. The tin in that world came from Afghanistan, and possibly from Cornwall, which is to say from either 2,000 miles east across mountains and deserts, or from an island off the far northwestern edge of everything. And either way, it came down a chain of middlemen so long that nobody at the receiving end had the first idea where the stuff was actually dug up. Think about what that means. Every single sword in the Iliad, each helmet and greave, the armour of Achilles, all of it depends on a substance that has to be carried the width of the known world by people who do not speak each other's languages, through territory nobody controls, in exchange for other goods continuously. Or the whole system stops. That is why the Late Bronze Age was so aggressively international. It had no choice. Egypt and the Hittites and the Mycenaeans and Babylon were not trading because they were enlightened. They were trading because none of them could make a knife on their own. And it is why the collapse was so total. When a civilization is built on a supply chain that long, and the chain breaks, everything downstream of it breaks too, and there is no local substitute, because there is no local tin. And the thing that came next, once the dust settled, is not a coincidence. Iron. Iron is worse than bronze in almost every way until you learn to work it properly. And it took centuries, but iron ore is everywhere. It is in the ground under your feet, in most of the world, and you do not need a caravan from Afghanistan to make a plough. The Iron Age is not an upgrade. The Iron Age is what people did when the tin stopped coming. So Troy, sitting on that strait, was not just charging a toll. It was sitting on one of the arteries of a system that could not survive without its arteries. And everybody knew it. And that is another reason a small city on a low hill mattered so much more than its size. And then the whole of that world ended. Not Troy. All of it. This is the part that most people have never been told, and it is one of the largest events in human history. Somewhere between about 1200 and 1150, before the Common Era, over roughly 2 generations, the entire Late Bronze Age system collapsed. Not declined, collapsed. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the earth, simply ceased to exist, and its capital burned. And its language stopped being written and was not read again for 3,000 years. Every major Mycenaean palace in Greece was destroyed, and Greece then forgot how to write entirely for 400 years. Which is why we call it a dark age and mean it literally. There are no documents, because there was no writing. Cities up and down the Levant burned. Egypt survived barely and never again mattered the way it had. Ugarit, a wealthy trading city in Syria, burned so fast that letters were still in the oven, where they were being baked when the fire took the building. And one of them is a message begging for help from an enemy that has already landed. Nobody knows why. That is the honest answer, and the honest answer has taken about a century to arrive at. There are earthquakes in the record, a whole sequence of them. There is drought, and the climate work is now quite clear that there was a long, serious dry period. There is famine, and there are Hittite letters about grain shipments in tones close to panic. There are the raiders the Egyptians recorded coming at them out of the sea, who may be a cause and may equally be a symptom. There is the fragility of the system itself, which was so interconnected that once a few nodes went, everything downstream of them went too. The current view is that it was all of it at once, a cascade, a whole civilization with too many things going wrong in the same 50 years and no slack left anywhere. And I have been saying nobody knows why the world ended, which is true, but the science has got a great deal better in the last 20 years, and it is worth telling you what it now says, because it is unsettling. The thing that has changed is that we can now read the climate. You take cores out of lake beds, out of peat, out of stalagmites in caves, out of the seabed. And in each of them, there is a record of what the weather was doing, year by year, in the pollen, in the isotopes, in the layers. And when they did that work across the eastern Mediterranean, the answer came back clear, and it came back the same everywhere. At the end of the late Bronze Age, there was a drought, a long one, decades of it, one of the more severe dry periods of the last several thousand years. And it landed on exactly the region and exactly the century in which every one of those civilizations fell over. And then, once you know that, the documents read differently. There is a Hittite letter about grain, requesting an urgent shipment, saying it is a matter of life and death. There is correspondence with Egypt about sending wheat. There is a letter from Ugarit, that trading city in Syria, and the tone of the last ones is not diplomatic. It is frightened. There is one that says, effectively, the enemy ships are here. Our army is in one place, and our fleet is in another, and the city has been left with nothing at all to defend it. And it was found in the oven, unbaked, unsent, because the fire arrived before the letter did. So the picture that has emerged, and it is now something close to consensus, is not one cause. It is a cascade. The rain fails. The harvests fail across a whole region at once. Not one kingdom, but all of them, so nobody can help anybody. Families start moving, because the hungry always do, and they turn up on somebody else's coast. And to that somebody else they are not refugees, they are raiders. And the Egyptians write them down as the sea peoples, and carve their likenesses on a wall at Medinet Habu, in profile, with their strange headdresses, still sailing. Trade routes break because trade needs peace. And the moment the routes break, the tin stops. And the tin is the whole system. And an earthquake or two on a coast that has plenty, into the middle of all that, none of those on their own, brings down a civilization. All of them, in the same 50 years, in a world that was already stretched to the limit of its own complexity, with everything depending on everything else, and nothing held in reserve, brought down every state from Greece to Mesopotamia, inside 2 generations. And the survivors could not read or write for 400 years afterwards. And Troy, which had been afraid for a century and had its grain buried under its floors, was standing in the doorway of all of it. On the busiest strait in the world, when the world stopped coming through, and Troy burned in exactly that window. But it burned twice, and the difference between the 2 endings is the whole of this story. So let us take them in order. The first one is about the year 1300, and it took the great city, Troy VI, the one with the leaning wall at the top of its prosperity, and it was not an army. When they went through that destruction layer, what they found was not what war leaves. The walls had gone over in a particular way, sections of them displaced and slumped and cracked, buildings down, and no arrowheads to speak of, and no bodies in the streets, and no sign that anybody had fought anybody. It looks, to the people who know what these things look like an earthquake. And that coast is one of the most seismically vicious places on Earth. It sits on the North Anatolian Fault, which is a monster, and it has been throwing cities down for as long as there have been cities on it, to throw. And here is the thing that makes it human rather than geological. They rebuilt immediately, straight away, on the same spot, with the same wall lines, using the same stones out of the rubble, and the pottery runs straight through without a break, which means it was not newcomers moving into an empty ruin. It was the same families, picking their own houses back up. They did not leave. Their city fell on them, and they cleared it and set it up again and carried on. Because the wind was still there, and the strait was still there, and where else would you go? But what they rebuilt is not the same place, and you can feel the difference in the archaeology. And it is the eeriest thing on the site. The rebuilt town, Troy VII, Phase A, is frightened. That is not a scientific term, and I am aware of it, but I do not have a better one, and neither, honestly, does anybody else. Here is what changed. In the great years, inside the walls, there were large houses on wide terraces with room to breathe. Now those same houses get chopped up. The rooms are subdivided, walls thrown across them, partitions run through what were once fine open halls, so that where one family lived, now several are living. The space between buildings fills in. The place gets crowded, fast. in a way that had never happened before in the history of that hill. And then the jars, all through Troy the Seventh. In house after house after house, they sank enormous storage jars into the floors. Great pithoi, big enough to hold a person, dug down into the beaten earth, so that only the neck and the lid sit above the surface, and there are hundreds of them. And they were found still in place. You do not do that for convenience. A jar in the floor is a jar you cannot move. It is difficult to fill and awkward to empty, and it takes days to install, and it permanently wrecks your circulating. There is one reason to sink your food into the ground inside your house, under your feet, under a lid, and that reason is that you expect to be inside that house, unable to leave for a very long time. And you expect that anything outside is not going to be there when you look for it. Put those two facts together and read them as one sentence. The population of the countryside has come inside the walls, and everybody is storing everything underneath their own floor. That is a city on a war footing. That is a city where the people from the farms have come in and are living 4 families to a house. And the grain is buried in the kitchen. Nobody wrote any of this down. There is not a word of testimony. It is just there in the plan of the houses and the holes in the floors, and it says, as plainly as anything I have ever heard from that far back, we are afraid, and it has been going on for a while. And we do not think it is going to stop. They lived like that for the better part of a century. The poem is a war poem, so let us be honest about what war actually was in that world. Because the Iliad is a fantasy about it, and the reality was something else. The Iliad's version is duels. 2 named heroes meet. They speak, they throw, one dies, somebody strips the armor. The armies stand about. It is essentially a series of single combats in front of a crowd, and it is thrilling, and it is almost certainly not how anybody fought. What we can reconstruct suggests something much less individual. Massed infantry with thrusting spears and big shields and chariots, which were not the tanks of the ancient world, but rather a very expensive taxi service and missile platform, driving along the front, while an archer or a spearman worked from the back of it. Bows, slings, and the sling stones at Troy are found in heaps, which tells you that a sling was not a shepherd's toy, but a serious weapon issued in quantity. And the wounds on Bronze Age skeletons are what you would expect. Heads, mostly, and forearms, which is where a shield does not reach. But the thing the poem is most wrong about is the siege. And this is where the 10 years become interesting. An army in that period could not besiege a city for 10 years. It is not a question of will, it is arithmetic. An army has to eat. A large force sitting outside a wall consumes an enormous quantity of food every single day, and it cannot grow any, and it strips the countryside bare within weeks, and then it starves, or it goes home, or it dies of disease, which in every pre-modern siege killed vastly more people than fighting did. There is a reason the Iliad, for all its 10 years, actually shows you almost nothing that looks like a siege. The Greeks in the poem are not blockading anything. They are camped on a beach, and the Trojans come out and fight them, and go back in, and everybody goes to bed. And there are hints in the poem itself, if you look, that the tradition knew. The Greeks are constantly raiding up and down the coast for supplies. And Achilles at one point complains about how many towns he has sacked, and the quarrel that sets the whole story in motion is about dividing loot from one of those raids, which is what it probably was. Not a 10-year siege. A season, or a series of seasons over many years, of a raiding force based on that beach, living off the country, taking the smaller places around, occasionally fighting the city, mostly extorting it. And then, 1 year, they got in, or somebody else did, and the city burned. The 10 years is very probably the tradition, compressing generations of intermittent trouble. Exactly the intermittent trouble the Hittite tablets grumble about, into one enormous war. Because a story needs one war and not a century of tedious coastal raiding. And the wooden horse is what you put at the end of a story, when the truth is that, After decades of this, somebody eventually left a gate open, and nobody living remembers who or why. And then, somewhere around 1180 before the Common Era, give or take a decade, it ended. And this time it was not the ground. The layer is unmistakable, and it is the reason we are all still arguing 3,000 years later. There is ash, a band of it, and in places it is a metre thick, which is an extraordinary quantity of burning, and it runs across the whole site. The mud brick has been fired in place, which takes a fire that has been going for a long time and has had a lot to eat. There is collapse, and in that layer, unlike the earthquake, there are the things an earthquake does not leave. There are arrowheads, bronze ones, in the destruction level, and some of them are lying in the streets, and some of them are in the walls, which is where arrows end up when they are shot at people and miss. There are sling stones in heaps, gathered ready in the way that you gather them when you are expecting to need a great many in a hurry. And there are people. There are human bones in that layer, scattered in the streets and in the ruins of the houses, unburied. That last one is the one that matters, and I want to explain why. Because it does not sound like much until you understand what these people believed. Nobody in that world left their dead lying. Nobody. Burial was not a nicety. It was the most serious obligation a human being had. And a body left unattended in the open was a catastrophe of a completely different order from the death itself. Every culture around that sea, without exception, took its dead and put them properly away. And there are whole works of literature built on the horror of a body left out. So when you find human remains lying loose in the streets of a burned city, in the ash, where they fell, you are not simply finding that they died, you are finding that there was no one to pick them up. Everyone who would have done it was dead or taken, or had run and not come back. The city did not decline, and it did not empty out, and it was not abandoned. Something came, and it burned it, and when the fire went out, there was no one on that hill who cared enough about those bodies to bury them. That is the archaeology. Ash a metre deep, arrowheads in the walls, sling stones in piles, and the dead where they fell. And the question everybody wants answered is the one I cannot answer, and I am not going to pretend. Because you deserve better than that. Was this the Trojan War? Was this Homer's fall of the city? And the honest position, which is boring and true, is the timing works, the manner works. And there is not one single item of evidence that ties it to the story we have. There is nothing in that ash with a name on it. There is no Achilles. There is no Helen. There is not a scrap of anything, anywhere, that suggests she was a person rather than a poem. And the coldest reading of her is that she is the reason a story needs, not the reason a town burns. There is no horse, and there never will be. The wooden horse is almost certainly a metaphor that got legs, and the best guesses are that it is either a memory of a siege engine, which the Assyrians were building in that period, and which people did name after animals, or a memory of the earthquake, because the god who breaks cities in that world, Poseidon, is also and always the god of horses. A horse breaks Troy. That is a very old joke about an earthquake, possibly, and the horse. I have given it a sentence and walked past it, which will not do, because it is the single most famous object in the history of storytelling, and almost everything you know about it is later than you think. Start here. The wooden horse is not in the Iliad, not a word of it. People are astonished when they hear that, and they should be. The Iliad does not contain the fall of Troy at all. It covers a few weeks in the 10th year of the fighting, and it ends with the funeral of Hector, and the city is still standing on the last page. And everybody in it is still alive. The horse is not there because the poem stops before it. It turns up, briefly, in the Odyssey, which is the later poem. And even there it is not narrated so much as referred to. A bard at a feast sings about it, and Odysseus weeps at his own story, which is a wonderful moment, but it is not a description. The full version, the one everybody actually carries in their head, with the Greeks pretending to sail away and the Trojans dragging it in through a hole in their own wall, and the priest who warns them and is killed by serpents out of the sea, is from Virgil in the Aeneid. And Virgil is a Roman writing in Latin around the time of the Emperor Augustus, which is to say, our standard account of the fall of Troy was composed roughly 1100 years after the event, in a different language, by a poet from a different civilization, for political reasons of his own. It is magnificent. It is also about as close to the Bronze Age as we are to the First Crusade. So what is it? And there are three answers, and I like all of them. The first is the dull one. It is a siege engine. The Assyrians in that general period built covered rams and assault sheds, timber frames on wheels, draped in wet hides to stop them being set alight, with men working inside them. And they gave them names. And a Greek travel writer of the 2nd century of our era said flatly that anybody who thinks the horse was literally a horse must take the Trojans for complete fools, and that it was obviously an engine. The earliest picture we have supports him rather nicely, on a storage jar from the island of Mykonos, from around 670 before the Common Era, which is the oldest depiction of the horse anybody has found. The thing has wheels and windows, with men looking out of them. That is not a statue. That is a machine drawn by somebody who still half remembered what it was for. The second is the ships. In that world, a ship is routinely called a horse of the sea, and the Greeks came in ships, and a memory of hulls drawn up on a beach with men coming out of them is not a difficult thing to turn. Over 400 years of singing into one enormous animal full of soldiers. But the third is the one that keeps me up, and it is the earthquake. Because the god who breaks Troy's wall in the poem is Poseidon. And Poseidon has two portfolios, and only two that matter here. He is the god of the sea, and he is the god of horses. The Greeks called him the earth shaker, and when the ground moved anywhere in that world, it was him. So you have a god who is simultaneously the horse god and the earthquake god, and a city whose wall we know, from the ground, was thrown down by an earthquake at least once, and a story in which the wall is finally breached by a horse. A horse brought down the wall of Troy. That may not be a riddle at all. That may just be what you say, in a language where the word for the thing that shakes the earth and the word for the animal belong to the same god. And then keep saying for 400 years after anybody remembers why. I cannot prove that, and neither can anyone else. But I would point out one small thing. Troy, the sixth, the beautiful one, with the leaning wall, so it did fall to an earthquake. And the city that burned afterwards, the frightened one, was the one the Greeks came for. So the tradition has, sitting in it, both a wall thrown down by the horse god and a wall thrown down by the horse god. It happened. It simply happened 100 years early to the wrong city, and with nobody in the wreckage but the people who lived there, who got up the next morning and rebuilt it. What we can say is this: a large, rich, heavily fortified place at the mouth of the Dardanelles, which had been living in fear behind its walls, with its grain in the floor for the best part of 100 years, was attacked and destroyed by fire at the very end of the Bronze Age, and the people in it were not buried. Greeks had been trading there for generations, and Greeks had been making trouble there for generations, and the Hittite king had complained about it in writing. That is all true, and none of it is Homer, and whether some ancestor of the man who sang the Iliad was standing in that plain, or heard about it from someone who was, and whether 4 centuries of singing turned a bad season on a strait into the greatest story in the world, is a thing that nobody now living will ever know. But somebody was at that loom. That much is not in dispute at all. So what happened to the women at the looms? I promised you that at the start of the evening, and I am going to keep it, and the answer is not in the poem. The answer is in a filing cabinet in Greece. When a Bronze Age city was taken, the men were killed. That is not Homer being dramatic. That is simply the practice of that world. And every source we have agrees about it. And the archaeology at Troy, with the bones lying unburied in the streets, That's inconsistent with it. The men were killed, and the women and children were taken, because women and children were the most valuable movable property a captured town contained. Not for the reason people assume, or not only. They were taken because they could work. A trained weaver was a capital asset, and a city like Troy was full of them. And they walked out of that gate in a line and went down to the ships, and they were cargo. And here is how we know, because the Greek palaces kept records, and the records survive. And they survive for the most beautiful and horrible reason. They were written on unfired clay, meant to be thrown away at the end of the accounting year. And the only ones we have are the ones that were baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace that was keeping them. The Greeks kept those documents in a script called Linear B, which is Greek, written in a clumsy borrowed syllabary. And it was not deciphered until 1952. And the tablets are not literature, they are inventories. They are the most boring documents ever produced by human beings, and they are the only unmediated voice we have from that world. And they are devastating. At Pylos, on the west coast of the Peloponnese, in the palace they still call the Palace of Nestor, the tablets record the workforce. Groups of women, with their children, receiving monthly rations of grain and figs, assigned to tasks. The numbers are not small, something over 600 women, nearly 400 girls, and a couple of hundred boys, counted in a single run of accounts. And the groups are labelled. Sometimes they are labelled by the job: flax workers, wool carders, spinners, weavers, textile decorators, and sometimes they are labelled by where they came from. There is a tablet at Pylos that reads, in its entirety, as an accountant's line, 21 Cnidian women, 12 girls, 10 boys. Knidos is not in Greece. Knidos is on the coast of Anatolia. There is another group called the Milesian women. Miletus is on the coast of Anatolia. There are Lemnian women from the island of Lemnos, which sits in the sea directly off Troy, close enough that on a clear day you can see it from the plain. There are women called, in the Greek of those records, the Assuan women, and the word behind it appears to be Assua, which is a Hittite name for a region of that same western shoreline, and which is very probably the root of the word Asia. Women from Knidos, Miletus, Lemnos, and Asia in a Greek palace, on grain and figs, weaving wool. And then there is the line that I cannot read without something going cold in me. Among the tablets there is a separate series that records the men and boys attached to these groups, and one of them says, at Pylos, the sons of the Cnidian women, 5 men, 4 boys. The sons of the Cnidian women. That is how they are filed. Not by their father, because nobody is recording a father. Because the question of who fathered them was not one the palace considered relevant to its accounts. They are their mother's sons, and their mothers are known by the name of a city on the other side of the sea. And they are all on the books. I have to be honest with you about the scholarly caution here, because it is real, and I am not going to sell you something. There is a long-standing argument about those ethnic labels. One school says exactly what I have just said. These are foreign women, brought over from the Anatolian coast, and at least one group in the tablets is described with a word that appears to mean captives, and the whole structure of it, the rationing, the palace's total control of their lives and their work and their children, points one way and one way only. The most thorough modern study of women in those tablets, by Barbara Olson at Vassar, works through it group by group, and concludes that these women were, in all probability, slaves. The other school points out that an ethnic label is not the same as a bill of sale, that people move for many reasons, that a group could be named for where its founders came from, generations back, and that we are reading a great deal into an accountant's shorthand. Both of those are fair, but look at what is not in dispute. Regardless of how they got there were, in a Greek palace at the end of the Bronze Age, sizable groups of low-status women, named after specific towns on the Anatolian coast, living on rations, working wool for the palace, with children who were recorded as belonging to their mothers and to no father at all. That is on the tablets. That is not an interpretation. And the historian Michael Wood, among others, has made the obvious point out loud. If you want a motive for Greeks crossing that sea over and over for generations, you do not need a beautiful queen. Look at the payroll. The women were the point. Weavers were wealth, and the coast opposite was full of them, and there is a reason those raids kept happening, and a reason the Hittite king kept having to write letters about it. The children next, because a third of them did not make it, and that fact is lying all through that hill. The child mortality of the Bronze Age is difficult to hold in your head. Roughly a third of everyone born died before the age of 5. In some populations it was worse. That is not a catastrophe or a plague year. That is the normal, expected, unremarkable arithmetic of ordinary life everywhere, for the whole of human history until about 150 years ago, which means that every woman on that hill who lived a full life buried children, not one, if she was unlucky. Several, as a matter of course, and she went back to the loom, because the cloth still had to be made. And here is the thing that tells you how they felt about it. Because people sometimes suggest that with numbers like that you must stop minding, and the archaeology says, flatly, no. Infants across that world are very often buried differently from adults, not in the cemetery outside the walls with everybody else, but inside, under the floor of the house, or in the courtyard, in a pot. Wrapped. Under the floor, where the family goes on walking every day, they kept them in the house. You may make of that what you like, and archaeologists argue about what it meant. But I know what it looks like to me, and I suspect I know what it looks like to you. And the children who lived were working almost at once. There is no long childhood in that world. A child is a small worker with a rising output. Girls were spinning as soon as their hands could manage it, which is to say at 5 or 6, because spinning is the endless bottleneck and everybody spins all the time. And a child's thread is not as good, but it is thread. Boys with the animals. Water carried. And in the Linear B tablets, look at what the accountants recorded. Not just the women, but the girls and the boys with them, counted separately. In their groups, on their rations. 21 women, 12 girls, 10 boys. The children are on the payroll. The palace was feeding them because it expected to get work out of them. And the girls in those columns were going to grow up to be the next generation of weavers, in a place their mothers had not chosen. So when I say the women of Troy went down to the ships, understand that the children went with them, and that this is not an inference from the poem. It is a line in an accounts ledger in Greece. And one more thing, and then I will leave the tablets alone. At Pylos, in the records, there is a woman who is named. That is rare. The working women are almost never named individually. They are counted. But there is one who receives an issue of rations so large that it would feed 20 workers for 20 days, which means she is somebody, a supervisor of some kind, a woman with responsibility inside that palace. And the scribe wrote her name down. Her name, in the Linear B, is Cassandra, which is, in later Greek, Cassandra. Cassandra, the name of the daughter of the king of Troy, the prophetess nobody believed. The woman who in the poem is dragged out of the temple when the city falls and taken to Greece as a prize and murdered there. That name is in the accounts of a Bronze Age Greek palace, on a clay tablet, 400 years before anybody sang the Iliad. Now, that is not her. Let me be completely clear, because this is exactly the sort of thing that gets misused. Cassandra is a perfectly ordinary Greek name, and the Cassandra of the tablets is a Greek woman doing a job, and she has nothing to do with Troy, but sit with what it means anyway. The names are real. Which is to say that when Homer reached for the name of a Trojan princess, 4 centuries later, in the dark, he reached for a name that had actually been in use in that world at that time, and he got it right. The way the tradition got Wilusa right, and got Alexandru right, and got the leaning wall correct, and got the horses correct. He did not know he was doing it. Nobody in that chain of singers knew. They were just handing it on. And Cassandra, because I said her name earlier and then walked past her, and she is the one I think about most. The story is this. She was a daughter of Priam and Hecuba, and Apollo wanted her and offered her the gift of prophecy for her consent, and she took the gift and then refused him, and he could not take the gift back, because a god's gift cannot be unmade. So he did something more elegant and much worse. He left her the sight, and added that nobody would ever believe a word she said, and so she spent her whole life knowing exactly what was going to happen, in detail, and saying it out loud, correctly, to everybody, and being laughed at. She told them about the ships. She told them what Paris would bring home. She stood in front of the horse, whatever the horse actually was, and told them, and they patted her hand and said, "Poor Cassandra," and took it inside the walls, and then the city fell precisely as she had promised it would. And she was taken from the temple where she had run, and given to Agamemnon as his portion of the loot, and shipped to Greece. And she knew what was waiting there too. There is a scene in Aeschylus, and it is one of the most extraordinary things in the whole of drama, where she is sitting in a cart outside the palace at Mycenae, a foreign woman, a prisoner, who has been silent for a very long time, and she suddenly starts speaking, and what she describes is the murder that is about to happen inside that house, hers and his, in the next few minutes, in complete accuracy. And the chorus of old men listen to her, and are moved, and say that they do not understand. And she goes in anyway. She walks into the house, knowing precisely what is behind the door, because there is nowhere else on earth for her to go, and the door closes, and it happens exactly as she said. Now, none of that is history, but as an image, I do not think antiquity produced a better one, and I do not think it is really about prophecy at all. It is about what it is to be a woman in that world who is right. She is not disbelieved because her information is bad. Her information is perfect. It is the best information anybody in the city has. She is disbelieved because of who is saying it, and the curse is not a supernatural affliction. It is simply an accurate description of her position, dramatized as magic. Apollo did not need to do anything to her. That was going to happen anyway. And her name, in a slightly older form, is sitting on a clay tablet at Pylos, attached to a real working woman who got a large ration of grain and figs 3,300 years ago, which does not mean she was real. It means the world she came out of was. And since we have arrived at Cassandra's name, there is one more thing the Greeks did about those women, and it is the strangest act of conscience in the ancient world. 7 or 8 centuries after the city burned, in Athens, at the great dramatic festival, in front of the entire citizen body, a playwright named Euripides put on a play about the fall of Troy, and he did not write about Achilles. He did not write about the horse, or the fighting, or the glory. He wrote a play in which the fighting is already over. Before the first line, the men are already dead. The city is already burning in the background, and the entire stage is occupied by the women of Troy, waiting on the beach, beside the ships, to be told which Greek has been allotted, which of them. That is the play. That is all it is. There is no plot in any conventional sense. Nothing is decided, nothing is resolved, nobody is rescued. It is a group of women in the worst hours of their lives being processed. Hecuba, who was the queen of that city an hour ago, is now property and is trying to work out whose Cassandra is taken. Andromache is taken, and then they take her child as well, because the Greeks have decided that the son of Hector cannot be allowed to grow up, and they take him off her and throw him from the wall. And she is not even permitted to bury him properly. And there is a scene in which the broken body of a small boy is brought back to his grandmother on his father's shield, and she washes him and lays him out, on stage, in front of 15,000 Athenians. Now hold the date up to the light, because this is the part that makes my hair stand up. Euripides put that play on in 415 before the Common Era. And a few months earlier, the Athenians had taken the island of Melos, which had done nothing except decline to join their empire, and had killed every adult man on it, and sold every woman and child into slavery. Everyone. It was a real event. The whole city knew about it. Some of the men sitting in that theatre had done it with their own hands. And Euripides put on a play in which Greek soldiers do exactly that to women on the beach, and asks the audience to sit there and watch it happen at the pace it actually happens, which is slowly, with paperwork. He did not win. He came second. But they let him do it, and they sat and watched it, and that play has never stopped being performed for 2,500 years. And it is put on somewhere in the world each time there is a war with women left over at the end of it, which is always, the Greeks won the Trojan War in the story. And then they wrote the definitive account of what winning looks like from the point of view of the cargo, and they wrote it about themselves, and they staged it in the city that had just done it. All of that came from the classical Greeks, centuries after the city fell, remembering and restaging a war their own ancestors had half forgotten. But between the burning of Troy and the first line of any of that poetry there is a long silence, and it is the strangest part of the whole story. We have a phrase for it, and we throw it about too lightly. A dark age. This one was not a metaphor. When the palaces burned, around 1200, the Greeks did not simply become poorer, they lost the technology of writing completely. The script they had was a palace tool. It existed to run the accounts, and when there were no more palaces, there were no more accounts. And within a generation, no one could do it, and there was nothing left worth doing it for. And that is the end of writing in Greece for something like 4 centuries, 400 years. Think about the length of that. It is longer than the United States has existed. It is Shakespeare to now. An entire span of time, 12 or 15 generations of human beings, in which not one person in Greece wrote a word, and therefore about which we know almost nothing. Because knowing things about the past is a thing you do with documents. And it was not only writing. The population fell, and in places it fell catastrophically. Whole regions emptied. The pottery gets worse and then much worse. Building in stone stops. The great walls are not repaired. They are simply lived beside, and then lived in, and then forgotten. Long-distance trade almost ceases. The things people made got smaller and cruder and more local, generation by generation, for centuries. And the forgetting is what I cannot get over. By the time the Greeks came out the other side, literate again, building temples again, they had no idea what had happened to them. They looked at the walls their own great-grandfathers many times over had built and said giants. They looked at the Tholos tombs and said treasuries of legendary kings. They had a story about a heroic age, an age of greater men before their own, which had ended in a catastrophe, and they were right. And they had no idea they were right, and they thought it was mythology. That is what a dark age is. It is not simply that the lights go out. It is that when they come back on, nobody in the room remembers what the room used to be. And through the whole of that dark, with no writing, with the population collapsed, with everything falling apart, somebody, every night, somewhere, was singing about a city on a hill by a strait, and getting the name of it right. We should stop and ask how any of it got across. Because I have been saying things like 400 years of darkness rather casually, and the mechanism is one of the great detective stories of the last century. Here is the problem. The city burns around 1180. The Greeks lose writing entirely within a generation or two, and do not get it back until about the 8th century. So between the fall of Troy and the composition of the Iliad, there is a gap of 400 years in which nobody in Greece could write anything down. Not a note. Nothing. And yet at the far end of that silence, a poem comes out that knows the name of the city, knows the older form of that name with the W still in it, knows that the wall leaned, has the Trojans keeping horses, places the geography correctly, and carries a set of names that turn out to be genuinely Bronze Age. How? For a long time, nobody had an answer, and the assumption was that Homer was a writer, a poet with a pen, inventing. And then, in the 1930s, a young American named Milman Parry went to Yugoslavia. Not to Greece, to the mountains of the Balkans with a recording machine, because he had a hunch. And what he found there were illiterate peasant singers in coffee houses who could not read a word, performing enormous heroic poems from memory for hours, night after night, and who had learned them from other singers who could not read either, and who were carrying material that in some cases was centuries old. And Parry watched how they did it, and it broke the problem open. They were not memorizing. That was the assumption, and it was wrong. They were composing live every time out of a kit. The kit is made of formulas, ready-made phrases, of the right metrical shape to slot into a line, that a singer has thousands of and deploys the way a jazz musician deploys a lick. Every hero has an epithet that fits the end of a line. There is a stock phrase for the sun coming up, and one for putting on armor, one for a man dying. And the singer builds the story in real time out of these prefabricated units, differently every night, never the same twice, and never wrong, because the units themselves are fixed and old and inherited, which is exactly what the Iliad is made of. And once Parry pointed at it, you cannot stop seeing it. Grey-eyed Athena, swift-footed Achilles, the wine-dark sea, rosy-fingered dawn, Troy of the good walls. They are not decoration. They are load-bearing. They are the bricks. And because they are fixed lumps of language handed from singer to singer as units, they carry things inside them, like flies in amber. The phrase gets passed on intact, even after nobody remembers what is in it. That is why the meter still needs the W in Wilios that nobody had pronounced for centuries. That is why the Trojans are still horse tamers. No one was preserving those facts. No one knew there were facts in there to preserve. The facts came along for the ride. Inside phrases that fitted the line for 400 years in the dark, in the mouths of men who could not write and had never seen the place. Parry died at 33, in an accident with a gun, having changed the subject permanently. His student Albert Lord finished the work. And that is the answer to how. The Iliad is not a memory of Troy. It is a machine that happened to have some Troy caught in its gears, which leaves the man himself, or the not man. And it is worth being clear about how little we have. We do not know who Homer was. His dates are a guess, somewhere in the 8th century before the Common Era, 4 centuries after the city burned. His birthplace is a guess too. And 7 cities claimed him, which is a way of saying that even the Greeks had no idea. Was he blind? That is a very old story, and it may simply be because a blind man is who you would expect to find making a living by singing. Did he compose both poems? There are good arguments that the Odyssey is a generation later, and somebody else entirely, and was he one person at all? Or a name attached to a tradition, the way a whole style of building can end up called after a single architect. What we can say is that something happened at the end of that tradition that had never happened to it before. For 400 years, the poems existed only in the air, made new every night, never fixed, never the same twice, dying with each performance and being born again at the next. And then, at some point, somebody wrote one down. That is the strangest event in the history of literature, and no account of it survives. The Greeks had just got an alphabet, borrowed off the Phoenicians and improved, and one of the very earliest things anybody did with it, on the evidence we have, was write down a line of verse. And somebody, at some point, sat down with this brand new technology and took a poem that took several nights to perform and put the whole of it on something, in a script that had only just been invented, from a singer, at dictation speed. It would have taken weeks. It would have been extraordinarily expensive. And whoever paid for it, and whoever did it, changed everything, because at that moment it stopped being alive and started being a text. Fixed. permanent, quotable, teachable, and identical for everybody forever after. And the reason I find this moving, rather than merely technical, is what it means about what we are holding. The Iliad is not a poem about the Bronze Age written by somebody in the Iron Age. It is the last performance of a Bronze Age song. Court. It is a recording. It is what happened to be in the tradition on the night. The machine was finally invented that could hold it still, and everything in it that is genuinely old. The leaning wall, the horse tamers, the W in Willios. The woman at the loom was already worn smooth by 400 years of being handed on before anybody ever thought to write it. We got one take. Everything else those singers knew, all the other songs, all the other cities, every other night in 4 centuries of nights, is gone. The hill did not stay empty, which surprises people. There was no dramatic abandonment, no silence for 1,000 years, no lost city swallowed by jungle. Somebody was living on Hisarlik again, almost at once, in the ruins, poorer, with different pottery, and the excavators call that Troy, the 7th, Phase B. And it is a sad little settlement built in the wreckage of a great one by whoever was left or whoever came next. And it went on, thinly, badly, through the Dark Age, and then the Greeks came back, properly, as colonists this time, and built a Greek town called Ilion on the same spot, on top of everything, and knew exactly what they were standing on. Because here is the extraordinary thing, they never forgot. Right through the Dark Age, with no writing at all, the memory of that hill survived. And by the time the Greeks were literate again, they were absolutely certain that this specific mound in Anatolia was the Troy of the poems, and they treated it accordingly. There was a temple of Athena up there. There were tourists. Xerxes of Persia stopped and sacrificed 1,000 cattle on his way to invade Greece, which is a piece of political theatre so heavy-handed it could have been designed by a committee. Alexander stopped there before he went east and ran a race, and took a shield off the temple wall that he was told had been there since the war, and carried it with him all the way to India. The Romans built a proper city on it, because the Romans had decided that they were themselves descended from Trojan refugees, and that this was therefore their ancestral hometown, and Julius Caesar's family claimed direct descent from Aeneas. And so imperial money went into the place for centuries. And in the course of building all of that, they levelled the top of the hill and threw the Bronze Age palace over the edge, in order to build a temple to honour the people whose palace it had been. There is no comment to make on that. It makes itself, and then, eventually, it went quiet. The Roman town faded, and the plain silted up so thoroughly that the sea moved miles away and left the harbour stranded inland, and the hill became a mound in a field, and then it became a place where farmers grazed animals, and then it became nothing at all. And for 1,000 years and more, educated Europe read the Iliad and agreed that it was a magnificent fiction about a city that had never existed, while it sat under a wheat field with its walls intact and its loom weights lying in the ash exactly where they had fallen. Somebody did think of looking in the end and dug, and found the walls and the weights and the burned rooms and all the rest of what we have spent this evening inside. That is a long story of its own, and it is not the one that matters tonight. What matters tonight is the place that was found and the women in it, and one woman above all, whom we have circled all evening and never quite faced, and Helen. We cannot get out of this evening without her. So let us look at her honestly, because she is the most famous woman who ever lived, and there is a very good chance she never lived at all. There is nothing. That is the plain answer, and it needs saying once, clearly. There is no Helen in the archaeology. There is no Helen in the Hittite tablets. There is no Helen in the Linear B. And there is not a single scrap of evidence outside Greek poetry that any such person existed. A war fought over a woman is, as an explanation for state violence, exactly the sort of thing that stories do, and that history almost never does. Cities are burned for the reason cities are always burned, which is that somebody wants what is inside them. and we have already seen what was inside this one and who was making it. But she is more interesting than that, because the Greeks themselves could not settle her. In the Iliad, remarkably, nobody hates her. She hates herself. She calls herself terrible things, and she is very nearly the only character in the poem who does. And when she walks along the wall, the old men of Troy, who have lost their sons because of her, look at her and murmur to each other that no one could blame the Trojans and the Achaeans for suffering so long for a woman like that, and then, in the same breath, say, "But let her go back in the ships anyway, before she destroys us and our children too." That is an extraordinarily grown-up piece of writing. And Priam, whose city is being levelled for her, calls her dear child and tells her she is not to blame, and that the gods did it. Homer will not condemn her. And I have never entirely worked out why, and then there is the other version, which almost nobody knows, and which I love. There was a tradition, and Herodotus took it seriously, and Euripides built a whole play on it, that Helen never went to Troy at all. In that version, she was taken off the ship in Egypt and held there safely for the entire war. And what went to Troy was a phantom, an image made out of cloud in her shape. And the Greeks and the Trojans destroyed each other for 10 years over a thing that was not there. And when Menelaus finally comes home by way of Egypt, there she is, and she has been sitting there the whole time, and everybody who died for nothing. Herodotus even gives his reason for believing it, and it is pure cold common sense. If the Trojans had had her, he says, they would have handed her back long before the 10th year, because no king on earth is so mad that he will watch his own sons and his own city destroyed for his brother's love affair. They did not give her back because they could not. They did not have her. I do not think that is to me this history either, but as a piece of thinking about war, it is 3,000 years ahead of schedule, and it came from the same people who made the poem, which means that at least some Greeks looked at their own founding story, in which the whole world burns for one woman, and said quietly, "That cannot be what happened, can it?" Something else happened, and somebody has made this up afterwards to cover it. And Hecuba, if Helen is the one everybody knows, Hecuba is the one who tells you what the story is actually about, and she gets left out. And I would like to put her back in. She is the Queen of Troy. She is Priam's wife, and she is the mother of most of the poem's Trojans, Hector and Paris and Cassandra, and a great many more. The tradition gives her 19 sons by Priam alone, and it is a way of saying, simply, that everything in that city came out of her. And the arc she gets, across the poem and the plays that came after, is the most sustained study of grief that antiquity produced. And it is one loss stacked on another, until there is nothing left to take. She watches from the wall while Achilles kills her son. There is a moment in the Iliad where she calls down to Hector, begging him to come inside the gate. And she opens her robe and reminds him that she fed him herself, at her own body, and that he owes her this, and he does not come in, and she watches him die. Later she asks, aloud, for the impossible. She says she would like to eat Achilles' liver, and it is shocking, and it is meant to be. Because Homer is showing you exactly what a mother is capable of wishing when you have done that to her son. And then she has to watch her husband go out, alone, at night, to beg the body back from the man who did it. And in the plays she keeps going, because the Greeks could not leave her alone. She is on the beach when the city falls, waiting to be allotted like everybody else, and she is given to Odysseus. And there is a line where she asks who is going to own her, and is told, and simply says, "Now I am a slave, and I am old, and my head is shaved." Her daughter is sacrificed on Achilles' tomb. Her grandson, Hector's boy, is thrown from the wall and brought to her. And she is the one who washes him and lays him out. And in Euripides, she gets one final thing taken, and something in her breaks. And she takes a revenge so terrible that the tradition says she stopped being human afterwards and was turned into a dog. I do not think Hecuba existed, but I think somebody did. Somebody who was the oldest woman in that city when it burned, who had had a great many children in it, because that is what a woman's life in that world was, who had watched most of them die before her, and who walked down that hill in a line in the ash, at whatever age she was, and got on a ship, and went to Greece, and ground another woman's grain, and wove another woman's wool until she died there. And she is not in the Iliad, because the Iliad is about the rage of Achilles. She is in the tablets. She is a line in a column, so many women, so many girls, so many boys, and the name of a town on the other side of the sea. So what was Troy really like? Let me try to answer it plainly. Now, with all of it on the table. It was a city of perhaps 5 to 10,000 people on a hill above a plain, 3 miles from a strait that every ship in that sea had to use and could not get up without waiting. It was Anatolian, not Greek. It spoke, most likely, Luwian, it answered, when it had to a Hittite emperor 700 miles east, who thought of it as a distant nuisance on the edge of the map. It had a wall that leaned, cut from limestone, with towers and a great gate, and it had a lower town outside that wall where most of the people actually lived. And around the whole of it, a ditch cut into bedrock that would stop a chariot. It had horses on the plain, and grey pottery on the tables, and Mycenaean cups in the good houses. It ate bread and oil and wine and beans, goat. It smelled of wood smoke and animals and the sea, and of the murex works, which we should be honest about, stank so appallingly that in later centuries dye workshops were placed downwind of everything. And its wealth was cloth, wool, spun and dyed and woven in enormous quantity in every house on upright looms by women for their whole lives, and sold to men who had no choice but to sit in the bay and wait for a wind that was not coming. That is the real Troy, not heroes. Thread, and it lived on that hill for 500 years. And it fell down in an earthquake and got straight back up, and then it spent the next century steadily more frightened, filling up with people from the countryside, chopping its beautiful houses into smaller and smaller rooms, and burying its food under its own floors. And then the thing it had been afraid of for 4 generations finally arrived, and the city burned to the ground, and the people in it were left where they lay. That is not the Iliad. The Iliad is a poem about glory and rage, and the terrible beauty of young men choosing to die. And it is one of the greatest things anyone has ever made. But it is not what the ground tells us. The ground says something quieter and much worse. It says, they were afraid for a very long time, and they kept working. And then it came, and here is what I keep coming back to at the end of all of it. Homer, or whoever Homer was, sang about the men. The poem is the wrath of Achilles. It says so in the first line. And every archaeologist who has ever put a spade into that hill has come up, over and over and over, with the tools of women. Thousands of loom weights, boxes of spindle whorls, grinding stones worn hollow, 10 kilos of shells for purple, a loom in a burned room with its weights lying in a row in the ash where they dropped when somebody let go of them. The poem remembers the heroes, the hill remembers the women, and the hill is the one that was actually there, and so let us leave them there. And let us leave them a long way before the ash. Go back to an ordinary afternoon, in the great city, in the good years, before the earthquake, and the fear, and the jars in the floor. It is late in the day, and the light is coming in low from the west, off the water, the way it does there. The wind is up, as it is nearly every day, coming down the strait and over the plain and against the leaning wall. And out in the bay there are ships that have been sitting for 11 days waiting for it to turn, and their crews are ashore and bored and buying things. Up on the terraces, inside the wall, the shutters are open and the light is coming through, and in the long rooms at the back of the houses, the looms are standing and the women are at them, as they were yesterday and will be tomorrow. The cloth is growing a finger's width a day. There is a fire in the middle of the floor of the great room, and something is going in a tripod pot. Somebody is at the grinding stone. The children are outside. And below, through the gate and down the slope, and out into the lower town, under what is now a wheat field, there are thousands more of them, in their own smaller houses, at their own looms, doing the same. All the way out to the ditch. Nobody in that city knows. They do not know about the earthquake, or the 100 years of fear, or the fire. They do not know about the Greeks, who are at this moment perfectly welcome and are down in the bay buying wool. They have no idea that 1,000 years from now a Roman work gang will shovel their king's house over the side, or that the sea will retreat and leave them stranded in a field, or that the whole world will decide they were never real. And they certainly cannot imagine that 3,100 years from tonight, a man from Ohio with a brush is going to kneel down in the burned floor of one of those rooms and find their loom weights lying in a row in the ash, in the order they hung, and lift them out, one at a time, and that a machine will read their streets through the soil, and that people will still be arguing about them. All they have is the wind, up as always, and the light going, and the cloth not finished. And that is where I will leave them, in the low sun, on the hill, with the shuttle still moving. It has been a long way to go tonight, and a long way back, and they have had their rest for 3,000 years now, and after your own long day. So should you, and if you would like there to be another one of these, you are always welcome to subscribe, which just means the next one will come and find you, instead of the other way about. It has been a real pleasure to have your company for these few hours, and so very far from here. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.